The stranger standing in Caleb Turner's kitchen wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to exist. For 3 years, no one had crossed the threshold of his ranch, without invitation, without warning, without consequence. Yet here she stood, calm as Sunday morning, stirring something that smelled like actual food over his cold stove, her boots leaving mud prints across floors that hadn't seen a woman step since the funeral. Caleb's hand hovered near the rifle he'd grabbed from the porch, his heart hammering against ribs that had forgotten how to feel anything but grief. The woman turned, met his eyes without flinching, and said 5 words that would unravel everything he thought he knew about survival. "I'm here to save your ranch." What Caleb didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the war for his land had already begun, and the enemy was closer than the horizon. If you want to see how far this story travels, drop a comment below with your city. Hit that like button. And whatever you do, don't leave before the end. The autumn wind carried the smell of dying grass across the Turner Ranch, a scent Caleb had grown so accustomed to that he barely registered it anymore. Everything about this land had become background noise, the creak of the windmill, the distant lowing of the few remaining cattle, the way the porch boards groaned under his weight each evening when he sat to watch the sun bleed out across the valley. 3 years of the same routine had turned his life into a series of mechanical motions. Wake, work, eat, sleep, repeat. No variation, no surprise, no hope. Which made the smoke rising from his chimney all the more impossible. Caleb reined in his horse 100 yards from the house, his entire body going rigid. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant someone was inside, and nobody, absolutely nobody, had any business being inside his house. His hand moved to the rifle scabbard on his saddle with practiced efficiency, fingers wrapping around worn wood that had belonged to his father. The weight of it steadied him, brought clarity to the chaos spinning through his mind. Cattle rustlers, drifters, revenue men. Each possibility flashed through his consciousness and was discarded just as quickly. Rustlers didn't light fires. Drifters didn't stick around. Revenue men came in groups and made noise. The house looked exactly as he'd left it that morning, weathered gray boards, sagging porch, windows that needed replacing. But the chimney told a different story. Steady smoke, not the thick black of accident or malice, but the controlled gray of someone who knew their way around a cook stove. Caleb dismounted slowly, keeping the rifle low but ready. His boots made no sound on the hard-packed earth as he approached. The front door stood slightly ajar, which struck him as either supremely confident or monumentally stupid. He'd locked that door. He locked it every damn day, not because he had anything worth stealing, but because the ritual of turning that key had become one of the few things that made him feel like he still controlled something in this world. The hinges didn't creak when he pushed the door open. Someone had oiled them. The interior stopped him cold. His house, his tomb of memories and dust, had been transformed. The floor had been swept clean, the table cleared of 3 years' worth of accumulated debris. The dishes he'd left stacked in the basin were washed and stacked neatly on the shelf. The stove that had gone cold the day after Sarah died now radiated heat, and on top of it sat a cast iron pot from which emerged the smell of actual stew. Vegetables, meat, herbs he didn't even know he still had. And standing at his stove, stirring his food in his pot, was a woman he'd never seen before in his life. She turned when the floorboard shifted under his weight, and Caleb found himself looking at someone who defied easy categorization. Somewhere in her late 20s, he guessed, though the road had etched itself around her eyes in ways that aged her. Dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, clothes that had seen better days but were clean and mended, hands that moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime working. But it was her eyes that caught him, sharp, assessing, carrying a weight of their own grief and determination. "You must be Caleb Turner," she said, her voice level and unafraid despite the rifle now pointing in her general direction. "Your house was unlocked." "Like hell it was." "All right, it was locked, but your back window doesn't latch properly, and the frame's rotted enough that a decent push opens it right up. You should fix that." She turned back to the stew, adding a pinch of something from a small cloth bag. "Also, your water pump needs new leather seals, 3 sections of your fence line are down, and unless I'm mistaken, you've got at least 24 head of cattle scattered across the eastern ridge with no one watching them, which means you're losing calves to coyotes and weight to poor grazing distribution." Caleb stared at her, his mind struggling to process not just the audacity of her presence, but the casual competence with which she'd apparently surveyed his entire operation in the time it took him to ride to town and back. "Who the hell are you?" "Elena Cross." She pulled 2 bowls from the shelf, his bowls, in his house, and began ladling stew into them with the comfort of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "And before you throw me out, you should know 3 things. First, I'm not here to steal from you, seduce you, or cause you any trouble whatsoever. Second, I'm a damn good ranch hand, and you clearly need one. Third, I haven't eaten a proper meal in 4 days, and neither have you based on the state of your pantry, so we're both going to sit down and eat this stew before we discuss anything else." She set both bowls on the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down as though she had every right to be there. Caleb's finger moved to the rifle's trigger, not threateningly, just resting there. "You've got 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't haul you to the sheriff right now." Elena picked up a spoon and took a deliberate bite of stew, her eyes never leaving his. She chewed slowly, swallowed, then set the spoon down with careful precision. "Because the sheriff's office is 8 miles away, and by the time you got there and back, this food would be cold and I'd be gone anyway. Because I'm not doing anything illegal by offering labor in exchange for temporary shelter. And because, Mr. Turner, whether you want to admit it or not, this ranch is dying, and you don't have the energy to save it alone." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Caleb had watched his ranch deteriorate for 3 years, each season stripping away another piece of what he and Sarah had built together. The cattle operation that had once supported 2 families now barely kept him fed. Fences that had stood proud were now held together with wire and prayer. The house that had been filled with laughter and plans now echoed with nothing but his footsteps and regrets. He lowered the rifle slowly, propped it against the wall, and moved to the table. The stew smelled better than anything he'd made himself in months, years maybe. His hand hesitated over the spoon, some part of him rebelling against this intrusion, this disruption of the careful numbness he'd cultivated. 3 days, he said finally, picking up the utensil. "You can stay 3 days. You do whatever work you think needs doing. We'll call it even for the meals and a place to sleep. After that, you move on." Elena nodded once, accepting the terms without argument. 3 days is enough to fix your immediate problems. After that, you'll at least have a working ranch again, even if you don't have the sense to keep it that way. They ate in silence, and Caleb hated how good the food tasted, hated how the warmth of it seemed to spread through his chest in ways he'd almost forgotten. He hated even more that the silence didn't feel oppressive the way it usually did. It felt almost comfortable. When the bowls were empty, Elena stood and began clearing the table with the same efficient movements she'd used for everything else. Caleb watched her, trying to piece together the puzzle of who she was and what she was running from. Because people who showed up uninvited at isolated ranches were always running from something. "The bunkhouse hasn't been used in a while," he said, standing. "It'll need airing out, but there's a stove and a bed." "I saw it this afternoon. Already got it cleaned up." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "You want to know my story?" "Not particularly." Liar. But she said it without heat, almost with amusement. "I'll tell you anyway because you've got a right to know who's sleeping on your property. My father owned a ranch about 60 miles south of here, built it from nothing, spent his whole life on it. 6 months ago, a man came through with legal papers saying my father owed money on the land title, old debts, complicated contracts, the kind of thing that doesn't make sense until it's too late. My father fought it, but the papers were official, stamped and signed by the county. We lost everything." She paused, her hand stilling in the wash basin. "My father had a stroke the day we had to leave. He's alive, but he's not the same. I've been traveling, working where I can, trying to find the man who did it. Trying to understand how someone can just steal everything a person spent their life building with nothing but paper and lies." Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. "This man have a name?" "Marcus Vane." Elena turned to face him fully, and in her eyes Caleb saw something he recognized intimately, the burning focus of someone who had lost everything and refused to accept it. "You heard of him?" "No." But even as he said it, Caleb felt the first whisper of unease. The valley had been quiet lately, almost too quiet. Ranchers who usually showed up in town for supplies had been absent. There'd been talk at the general store about legal troubles, about property disputes, but Caleb had tuned it out the way he tuned out most things these days. "You will," Elena said quietly. "Men like Vane, they don't stop with one ranch. They find a system that works, and they keep using it until someone stops them." She crossed to the door, pausing with her hand on the frame. "I'll be up before dawn to start on those fences. Don't worry about breakfast. I brought some supplies with me. Small payment for the hospitality." "Elena," Caleb's voice stopped her. "The window latch. You really should have just knocked." For the first time, something like a smile ghosted across her face. "Mr. Turner, if I'd knocked, you would have sent me away without opening the door. We both know it." She left before he could argue, her footsteps fading toward the bunkhouse across the yard. Caleb stood in his clean kitchen, surrounded by the lingering smell of food and the unsettling feeling that the carefully constructed walls of his isolation had just developed their first serious crack. He walked to the back window she'd mentioned and examined the frame. She was right. The wood was rotted, the latch barely functional. He'd noticed it a year ago and done nothing about it, the same way he'd done nothing about 100 other small failures that had accumulated into the slow death of this place. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Caleb lay in his bed, the bed he'd shared with Sarah, the bed where he'd watched her fade away from the fever that took her, and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of another human presence on his property. The distant clank of metal from the bunkhouse as Elena settled in. The way the wind sounded different when it wasn't just carrying his own loneliness across the valley. He tried to feel angry about the intrusion, violated even, but the emotion wouldn't come. Instead, he felt something more unsettling, curious. It had been so long since he'd felt curious about anything. Dawn came cold and clear, painting the valley in shades of gold and shadow. Caleb dressed in the dark, moving through the motions of his morning routine with the precision of 3 years' practice. But when he stepped outside, he found his routine already disrupted. Elena was at the corral, working with a proficiency that spoke of years in the saddle. She'd somehow caught and saddled his most temperamental horse, a rangy sorrel mare that barely tolerated Caleb himself, and was checking the animal's hooves with calm competence. A collection of tools lay organized on the ground nearby: fence pliers, wire, staples, a hammer. "Coffee's on the stove," she called without looking up. "Figured you'd want it before heading out." "I work alone." "Not today, you don't." She straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "I told you I'd fix your immediate problems. Can't do that sitting in the bunkhouse. I mapped your fence lines yesterday afternoon, got a general sense of what's down and what's just weak. Thought we'd start on the eastern section, work our way around. Should take us most of the day if we're efficient about it." Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to reassert control over his own land and routine, but the practical part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through 3 Montana winters, recognized the sense in what she was proposing. The eastern fence line had been on his mental list of urgent repairs for months, always getting pushed back because tackling it alone meant a week of work he couldn't spare. "Fine," he said, surprising himself. "But we do it my way." Elena's lips twitched. "Of course, it's your ranch." They rode out as the sun cleared the horizon, their horses moving through the tall grass with the easy rhythm of animals that knew this country. Caleb found himself watching Elena from the corner of his eye, noting the way she sat her saddle like someone born to it, the way her eyes constantly scanned the landscape, cataloging details most people would miss. "You grow up on a ranch?" he asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for the better part of a mile. "Every day of my life until 6 months ago." She pointed toward a cluster of willows marking a seasonal creek bed. "Your cattle favor that area. Saw tracks yesterday, fresh enough that they're still using it as a regular route. Might want to run a fence spur down there, keep them from overgrazing it." Caleb looked where she indicated and felt a flash of something uncomfortably close to embarrassment. She was right, of course. He'd been so focused on just maintaining what he had that he'd stopped thinking strategically about the land, stopped planning for anything beyond getting through the next season. The eastern fence line was worse than he'd remembered. Whole sections had collapsed under the weight of last winter's snow and spring's flooding, leaving gaps wide enough to lose half his herd through. Elena dismounted and began assessing the damage with the systematic approach of someone who'd done this kind of work countless times. We'll need to pull these posts entirely, she said, kneeling beside a rotted support. Ground's been too wet too long. They've lost their integrity. You got replacement posts stored somewhere? Shed behind the house. Cut them 2 summers ago. Never got around to installing them. Something shifted in her expression, too quick to read, but he thought it might have been understanding. Not pity. He couldn't have tolerated pity, but recognition of the paralysis that came with loss. The way even simple tasks became insurmountable when the reason for doing them had died. They worked through the morning in a rhythm that developed naturally, without need for discussion. Caleb would pull the old posts while Elena measured and marked positions for new ones. She'd set the posts while he strung wire. The work was hard and familiar, the kind of labor that left no room for thought beyond the immediate task. Sweat soaked through their shirts, despite the autumn chill, and their hands grew raw from the constant friction of wire and wood. Around midday, they stopped to water the horses and share the food Elena had packed: hard bread, cheese, dried meat. Simple fare, but Caleb found himself eating with more appetite than he'd had in months. "You're good at this," he said, gesturing vaguely at their morning's work. Elena took a drink from her canteen before answering. "My father believed in teaching by doing. Soon as I could sit a horse, I was working alongside him. Learned everything there was to know about keeping a ranch running." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Didn't teach me anything about keeping it from being stolen by men with lawyers and forged documents." "How do you know they were forged?" "Because my father never borrowed money against the land. Never. It was his one absolute rule: the land stays free and clear, no matter what. He'd go without food before he'd mortgage a single acre." She stared out across the valley, her eyes distant. But the papers said otherwise. Had signatures that looked like his, dates that matched up with years when we'd had hard times. They were good forgeries, good enough that the court accepted them without question. Caleb felt the story resonating with something in his own experience, though his loss had been different. Sarah's death had been an act of nature, cruel but comprehensible. What Elena described was something else entirely, a calculated theft dressed up in the language of law and legitimacy. "This Marcus Vane," he said carefully. "You think he's working alone?" "No." Elena's voice hardened. "This kind of operation takes resources. Forgers, lawyers willing to look the other way, county officials who can be bought or intimidated. Vane's just the face of it, the man who shows up with the papers and makes it all seem legal. But behind him, there's a whole network of people getting rich off stolen land." They returned to work, but the conversation had shifted something between them. Caleb found himself paying more attention to Elena's words, her observations about the land and the valley. She pointed out things he'd stopped noticing, the way certain ridgelines would provide natural protection for cattle in winter, how the water sources could be better managed to support a larger herd, where the soil was rich enough to support cultivation if he ever wanted to diversify beyond ranching. It was like looking at his own land through fresh eyes, seeing not what it had been or what he'd lost, but what it could still become. By late afternoon, they'd completed nearly half the eastern fence line, more progress than Caleb had made in the previous 6 months combined. His shoulders ached with honest fatigue, the kind that came from productive work rather than just endless maintenance of gradual decay. As they rode back toward the house, Elena suddenly reined in her horse, her body going tense with alertness. Caleb followed her gaze and saw what had caught her attention: a rider approaching from the direction of town, moving at a pace that suggested purpose rather than casual travel. "You expecting company?" Elena asked quietly. "Never expect company." Caleb's hand moved unconsciously toward the rifle scabbard on his saddle. "Nobody comes out here unless they've got a specific reason." The rider resolved into familiar form as he drew closer: Bill Hendricks, who owned the spread adjacent to Caleb's southern border. But there was something wrong in the way Bill sat his horse, a defeated slump to his shoulders that Caleb had never seen before. Bill had always been one of those indefatigable optimists, the kind of man who could find a silver lining in a Montana blizzard. "Caleb!" Bill called out when he was close enough, his voice rough with emotion. "Gotta talk to you. It's important." They met in the yard, and up close, Caleb could see the toll the last weeks had taken on his neighbor. Bill looked like he'd aged 10 years, his face drawn and gray, his eyes carrying a haunted quality that made Caleb's stomach clench with foreboding. What happened? Caleb asked, dismounting. Bill's eyes flickered to Elena, uncertainty crossing his face. She started to move toward the bunkhouse, giving them privacy, but Bill shook his head. No, stay. You should probably hear this too, whoever you are. Everyone in the valley's going to know soon enough. He pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket with hands that shook slightly. Man came through 3 days ago. Name of Marcus Vane. Had papers saying I owed money on my land, old debts from before my father died, contracts I'd never heard of, liens I'd never signed. Showed me stamps from the county recorder's office, signatures from officials. All looked official as Sunday church. Caleb felt Elena stiffen beside him, but she remained silent, letting Bill continue. Gave me 30 days to pay $20,000 or he takes the ranch. Bill laughed, a bitter sound with no humor in it. 20,000. I don't have 2,000, let alone 20,000. Been a hard few years, you know that. Lost too many calves to that late freeze in spring, prices have been down, costs keep going up. I got maybe 4,000 in savings, and that's after selling everything I can spare. Have you talked to a lawyer? Caleb heard himself ask, though he could already guess the answer. Can't afford one. Nearest lawyer willing to take on this kind of case is in Helena, wants 500 just to review the documents. I don't have 500. Bill's voice cracked. 37 years my family's owned that land. My father built that house with his own hands, and now some stranger with paper and ink is going to take it all because I can't prove a negative, can't prove I didn't sign something 20 years ago. Elena stepped forward, her voice gentle but intense. Mr. Hendricks, I need you to look at those documents very carefully. The signatures, the notary seals, the dates. Is there anything about them that feels wrong, even slightly off? Bill looked at her with surprise, as if only now fully registering her presence. Who are you? Someone this happened to 6 months ago. Someone who lost everything the same way you're about to lose everything. She held out her hand. May I see the documents? Bill hesitated only a moment before handing them over. Elena moved to better light, spreading the papers out on the porch steps with the careful attention of someone examining evidence. Her fingers traced over the text, the signatures, the official stamps and seals. Caleb watched her work, noting the way her jaw clenched tighter with each page she reviewed. When she finally looked up, her eyes were hard as flint. It's the same pattern. Look here. She pointed to a notary seal on one of the documents. See how the impression is perfectly even? Real notary seals have slight variations in pressure, tiny imperfections. This is too perfect. It's from a stamp, not an embosser. And here, she indicated a signature. The ink is the same shade and consistency across documents supposedly signed years apart. Ink fades differently depending on storage conditions, light exposure. These should vary more than they do. You saying these are fake? Bill's voice carried desperate hope. I'm saying they're very good forgeries. Good enough to fool most people, especially people who don't know what to look for. Elena's hands curled into fists around the papers. But they're the same quality as the ones used against my father. Same techniques, probably the same forger. Caleb felt a cold anger beginning to kindle in his chest, different from the numb resignation he'd carried for 3 years. This was focused, purposeful. Bill? Who else has Vane approached? Near as I can tell, Tom Whitmore, Sarah Chen, the Albertson brothers, maybe others who haven't said anything yet. He seems to be working his way through the valley systematically, and Caleb, Bill's voice dropped. Your ranch sits right between the 2 best water sources in this whole region. If I were him, you'd be next on my list. The 3 of them stood in the fading afternoon light, the weight of Bill's words settling around them like snow before a storm. Caleb looked out across his land, the fences they'd just repaired, the house Sarah had loved, the creek where they'd planned to build that addition before she got sick. 3 years of grief had convinced him he had nothing left to lose. He'd been wrong. Elena, he said quietly, how much do you know about proving document fraud? Enough to know we'd need an expert, someone who specializes in forensic document examination, who can testify in court about forgery techniques. She met his eyes. I've been looking for someone like that for 6 months. Haven't found them yet. Then we find them. Caleb turned to Bill. How long until Vane comes for the other ranchers? He said he's giving everyone 30 days, wants to keep things civilized and legal. Bill spat the last words like they tasted bad. But between you and me, I think he wants us to panic, wants us desperate enough to sell cheap rather than fight. Some people will, Elena said softly. Not everyone has the resources or the will to stand against someone with official-looking papers and lawyer talk. That's what men like Vane count on. Caleb looked at the document in Elena's hands, at the too-perfect seal and the suspiciously consistent ink. 3 days ago, his biggest concern had been whether he could make it through another winter alone. Now he was staring at the possibility of losing everything, not to time or nature or honest failure, but to calculated theft dressed up as legal process. The old Caleb, the one who'd existed before Sarah's death, would have known exactly what to do. That Caleb had been a fighter, someone who'd carved a life out of hard ground through sheer, stubborn will. But 3 years of grief had worn that man down to almost nothing, had convinced him that fighting was pointless when the universe could take everything you loved without warning or reason. He felt Elena watching him, measuring him, wondering which Caleb would emerge to face this threat, wondering if he had enough left in him to be worth her 3 days of labor. Bill's voice cut through his thoughts. I know you've been through hell, Caleb. Know you haven't had much fight in you since Sarah passed. And I wouldn't ask except I got nowhere else to turn. But if anyone in this valley has the stubbornness to stand up to this Vane character, it's you. You and Sarah, you never backed down from anything when you were building this place. Sarah's gone, Caleb said, and the words still hurt to speak even after 3 years. I know, but you're not. Bill looked at him with a desperate hope that was painful to witness. And maybe that's enough. The sun was setting now, painting the western sky in shades of amber and blood. Caleb thought about his 3-year routine of wake, work, eat, sleep, repeat. Thought about the empty house and the dying ranch and the careful numbness that had kept him functional, if not alive. Thought about how Elena's presence had disrupted all of that in less than 24 hours, forcing him to see what he'd been deliberately ignoring. He thought about Marcus Vane, whoever he was, counting on that numbness, counting on beaten-down ranchers being too tired and broken to fight back against official-looking paper and legal threats. Where's Vane staying? Caleb asked. Bill blinked in surprise. Got himself a room at the Grand Hotel in town. Acts like he owns the place already. Then I think it's time someone paid him a visit. Caleb looked at Elena. You said you've been searching for this man for 6 months. You willing to keep searching for a few more days? Something fierce and bright flashed across Elena's face. Mr. Turner, I'd search for him until the day I died if it meant stopping what he's doing. Good. Caleb turned back to Bill. Go home. Don't sell, don't panic, don't do anything except sit tight and keep your mouth shut about this conversation. Give us a chance to figure out what we're dealing with. You really think you can stop him? Man like that, he's got lawyers, resources, connections? Maybe. Maybe not. Caleb felt something stirring in his chest, something he'd thought died with Sarah. But I'll tell you what I do know. This is my land. My father broke his back clearing it, I nearly broke mine building on it, and my wife is buried under that oak tree by the creek. Marcus Vane wants to take it from me. He's going to have to do better than forged paper and legal tricks. Bill's face transformed, hope replacing some of the defeated exhaustion. You mean that? Every word. And as Caleb spoke them, he realized he did mean them. The numbness that had protected him for 3 years was cracking apart, and underneath it was anger, clean, focused anger at the sheer injustice of men who profited from other people's honest work and grief. After Bill rode off into the gathering darkness, Caleb and Elena stood in the yard, the silence between them different now, charged with purpose. This is going to be dangerous, Elena said quietly. Men like Vane don't build empires on forgery without being willing to protect them. Push too hard, and we might find ourselves facing more than just legal troubles. I know. You could also just let it happen. Sell out, take whatever money he offers, start over somewhere else. A lot of men would make that choice. Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, seeing past the road dust and the worn clothes to the steel underneath. Would you have made that choice if you'd been given the option 6 months ago? No. The word came without hesitation. I'd have fought until I had nothing left to fight with. Then I guess we're the same kind of stupid. Elena laughed, a short, sharp sound that held more determination than humor. Guess we are. She glanced toward the house, where lamplight now glowed in the windows. We should eat, get some rest. Tomorrow we ride into town, find out what we can about Marcus Vane, who he's talked to, who he's working with, where his money comes from. You can't fight an enemy you don't understand. Thought you only had 3 days. I lied. She met his eyes without apology. I had nowhere else to go, no other leads to follow. Was planning to stay as long as you'd let me, working for room and board while I figured out my next move. The 3-day thing was just to make you feel like you had control over the situation. Caleb should have been angry at the manipulation, but instead he found himself almost admiring the pragmatism of it. You always this honest about your dishonesty? Only when circumstances change. She started toward the house, then paused. Thank you for deciding to fight, for giving me another chance at the man who destroyed my father. Don't thank me yet. We haven't won anything. No, Elena agreed, but we're not beaten either, and sometimes that's enough to start with. They prepared and ate dinner in companionable silence, the day's hard work and the evening's revelations having created a strange camaraderie between them. Caleb found himself noticing small details. The efficient way Elena moved through the kitchen, the slight tremor in her hands when she thought he wasn't looking, the hard set of her jaw that suggested she was already planning their next moves. As darkness settled fully over the valley, Caleb walked out onto the porch one last time, looking toward the distant lights of town where Marcus Vane presumably slept in comfort, confident in his schemes and his forged documents. Somewhere out there, other ranchers were facing the same crisis as Bill, making impossible calculations about whether they could afford to fight or whether surrender was their only option. The wind carried the scent of autumn grass and distant rain, the same wind that had blown across this land for thousands of years before white settlers arrived, the same wind that would blow long after whatever happened in the coming weeks was forgotten. But for now, in this moment, Caleb Turner stood on his porch and felt something he hadn't felt in 3 years, the electric anticipation of a fight worth having. Behind him, through the open door, he could hear Elena washing dishes, humming something low and tuneless under her breath. Tomorrow they would ride into town and begin the dangerous work of unraveling Marcus Vane's schemes. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. But tonight, for the first time since Sarah's death, Caleb's house held the sounds of life again. Another human voice, another presence, another reason to keep the lamps burning against the dark. He looked toward the oak tree where Sarah rested, barely visible in the starlight. I know I've been useless, he said softly to the night, to her memory, to himself. But maybe I've got one more fight left in me. Maybe I can keep what we built. Maybe that's enough. The wind sighed through the grass, offering no answers, but Caleb didn't need answers. He needed only what he'd found today, a reason to care whether tomorrow came, and someone to stand beside him when it did. He went inside, locked the door behind him, made a mental note to fix that back window latch, and for the first time in 3 years, went to bed thinking not about what he'd lost, but about what he still had left to defend. Outside, the valley slept, unaware that the war for its future had just begun. The ride into town began in silence, both Caleb and Elena lost in their own thoughts as the morning sun climbed over the eastern ridge. The horses moved at an easy pace along the rutted road that connected the scattered ranches to what passed for civilization in this part of Montana. Caleb watched the landscape roll by with new eyes, seeing not just his own property, but the entire valley as a connected whole. A community of people who'd built their lives on this hard ground, now facing a threat none of them had seen coming. Tell me about the forgeries again, Caleb said, breaking the silence. The details that gave them away. Elena shifted in her saddle, her gaze focused on the horizon. It's in the small things. Real legal documents from 20 years ago would show aging, fading, slight discoloration, maybe water stains or fold marks from being stored in filing cabinets. Vane's documents looked too pristine, like they'd been created yesterday and artificially aged, just enough to seem legitimate, but not enough to match reality. And the notary seals? That's the most telling part. Every notary has their own embosser, and each one creates unique impressions, slight variations in pressure, sometimes a worn edge on one of the letters, maybe a tiny misalignment. The seals on my father's documents and on Bill's were identical. Not similar. Identical. Which means they came from the same stamp, created by the same forger. She paused, her jaw tightening. I spent 2 months tracking down the notary whose name appeared on our papers. Found her in a sanitarium outside Billings. She'd been there for 5 years, completely incapacitated. Someone had stolen her seal after she was committed, been using it ever since. Caleb felt his hands tighten on the reins. You find out who took it? The trail went cold. The sanitarium had changed hands twice since she was admitted. Records were a mess. But I'd bet my life Marcus Vane knows exactly who has that seal because he's been using it to legitimize his thefts across half of Montana. The town of Dry Creek appeared gradually as they crested a low rise, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single main street with the church spire and the Grand Hotel marking the northern and southern ends respectively. It wasn't much, but for the ranchers scattered across the valley, it was the hub of their world. The general store, the bank, the telegraph office, the sheriff's office, all the institutions that connected them to the wider world beyond the grasslands. Caleb noticed immediately that something was wrong. The usual morning activity seemed muted, subdued. Small groups of men stood in tight clusters outside the feed store and the saloon, their voices low and urgent. Women hurried past with their eyes down, avoiding conversation. The whole town had the tense, fearful atmosphere of a place under siege. Word spread, Elena observed quietly. They hitched their horses outside the general store, and Caleb was barely halfway up the steps when Jacob Barnes emerged, his weathered face drawn with worry. Jacob had run the store for 20 years, knew every rancher in the valley by name and credit history. Caleb, Jacob's voice carried relief mixed with desperation. Glad you're here. Heard about Bill Hendricks? Heard. That's why I'm in town. It's not just Bill anymore. Tom Whitmore got served papers yesterday afternoon. Sarah Chen this morning. People are scared, Caleb. Really scared. Jacob's eyes flickered to Elena. Curiosity obvious, but polite enough not to ask directly. This is Elena Cross, Caleb said. She's helping me look into Marcus Vane. Recognition flashed across Jacob's face. Cross? Any relation to Daniel Cross? Ran a spread down near Red Lodge? Elena's expression went carefully neutral. He was my father. Was. Jacob's voice softened. I'm sorry. Dan was a good man, honest as they come. He's alive, just not himself anymore. Lost the ranch 6 months ago to the same kind of fraud that's happening here now. Elena stepped closer, her intensity focused. Mr. Barnes, I need to know everything you've heard about Marcus Vane. Where he came from, who he's working with, what people are saying. Jacob glanced around nervously, then gestured them inside the store. The familiar space smelled of leather and tobacco, coffee, and dry goods. He moved to the back, away from the windows, and when he spoke his voice was barely above a whisper. Vane showed up 3 weeks ago, took the best room at the Grand Hotel, paid in cash for a month in advance, started asking questions about the valley. Who owned what? Who'd been here longest? Who might be struggling financially? Friendly enough on the surface, but there was something about him that put my teeth on edge. Too smooth, too interested in other people's business. You talked to him directly? Caleb asked. Once. He came in asking about supplies for ranching operations, wanted to know about seasonal challenges, water rights, that sort of thing. Said he was thinking about investing in the area, looking for opportunities. Jacob's mouth twisted bitterly. Guess we know now what kind of opportunities he meant. Has he been alone or does he have people with him? 2 men travel with him. One's clearly a lawyer, carries himself like city folk, always has a leather document case. The other... Jacob hesitated. The other's harder to read. Dresses like a cowhand but moves wrong. Too deliberate. Got eyes that don't miss anything. I'd bet money he's security. Maybe worse. Elena and Caleb exchanged glances. The picture Jacob was painting matched what Elena had described from her father's situation. A carefully orchestrated operation with multiple people playing specific roles. Where's the sheriff in all this? Caleb asked. Jacob's silence was answer enough, but he finally said, Tom Mallory's a good man in most circumstances. But he's out of his depth here. Vane comes in with official-looking documents, legal language, county seals. What's Tom supposed to do? He's not a lawyer, doesn't know enough about document fraud to challenge it. And Vane's been careful to keep everything looking legitimate, threatening lawsuits against anyone who interferes with proper legal proceedings. Convenient, Elena muttered. There's something else. Jacob moved to the window, peering out at the street. Some of the ranchers, the ones hit first, they're starting to break. I heard the Albertson brothers are meeting with Vane this afternoon, probably to negotiate a sale. Once that dam breaks, once people start selling out of fear, the whole valley could go in a matter of weeks. Caleb felt the urgency of the situation pressing down on him. They needed to move fast, needed to find something concrete they could use to expose Vane before panic turned into a stampede. Jacob, you know anyone in town who might have expertise with legal documents? Someone who could examine what Vane's been serving people? Not in Dry Creek. Nearest lawyer worth a damn is in Helena, and that's 3 days hard riding. Jacob thought for a moment. But there might be someone else. Samuel Rourke. Who's that? Former federal land examiner. Worked for the government evaluating land claims and property titles for 20-some years before he retired. Lives about 30 miles east of here, keeps to himself mostly. But if anyone around here would know how to spot fraudulent land documents, it'd be him. Elena's eyes lit up. A federal examiner would have seen every kind of forgery and title scheme there is. If we could get him to look at these documents, big if, Jacob warned, Sam's not exactly sociable. Retired out here specifically to get away from people and legal complications. Might not want to get involved. He'll get involved if we make him understand what's at stake, Caleb said, with more confidence than he felt. Can you tell us how to find him? Jacob sketched a rough map on a piece of brown paper, marking landmarks and distances. Old homestead cabin near Copper Creek. Can't miss it. He's got the only painted fence for 20 miles. Fair warning, though, Sam's got a reputation for greeting unexpected visitors with a shotgun and bad temper. We'll manage. Caleb folded the map carefully. One more thing. Where can we find Marcus Vane right now? Probably at the hotel. He keeps regular hours. Breakfast at 8, then he receives people in his room all morning. Acts like he's running a business instead of stealing people's lives. Jacob's voice hardened. Caleb, be careful. Whatever you're planning, Vane's not the kind of man you can intimidate or outfight. He's smart, connected, and from what I've seen, absolutely ruthless in a civilized sort of way. Then it's a good thing I'm not planning to be civilized. They left the store and stood on the wooden sidewalk, watching the town go about its anxious business. Caleb could see it now that he was looking for it. The fear in people's faces, the way conversations died when strangers approached, the sense that everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. We should talk to the people Vane's already targeted, Elena said. See if there are patterns in his approach, maybe find weaknesses in his scheme. After we see him first. Elena turned sharply. That's a bad idea. We don't know enough yet, don't have any leverage. All we'd be doing is showing our hand and putting him on alert. Maybe. But I want to see this man face to face. Want to know what we're dealing with before we ride 30 miles to track down a hermit who might shoot us on sight. Caleb started toward the Grand Hotel, his stride purposeful. Besides, sometimes the best way to learn about your enemy is to let them think they're in control. Elena caught up with him, her expression torn between frustration and grudging respect. You have a plan, or are you just making this up as you go? Little of both. The Grand Hotel was the finest building in Dry Creek, which wasn't saying much. 2 stories of whitewashed wood with actual glass windows and a covered porch. The lobby smelled of cigar smoke and furniture polish, with a threadbare carpet that had probably been impressive 20 years ago. Behind the desk, the clerk, a thin man named Peterson, looked up nervously at their approach. Help you folks? Marcus Vane, Caleb said simply. We're here to see him. Peterson's nervousness increased visibly. Mr. Vane is occupied this morning with appointments. If you'd like to schedule, we wouldn't. Caleb's voice carried the flat certainty of someone not accustomed to being refused. Tell him Caleb Turner wants to discuss property matters. He'll see us. The clerk hesitated, clearly weighing his fear of Vane against his discomfort with the intensity radiating from Caleb. Finally, he scurried up the stairs, returning a minute later with obvious relief. Room 7. Mr. Vane says he can give you 10 minutes. The hallway upstairs was narrow and dim, with doors leading to rooms that probably housed traveling salesmen and the occasional family passing through. Room 7 stood at the end, its door slightly ajar. Caleb knocked once, firmly, then entered without waiting for an invitation. Marcus Vane stood by the window, a cup of coffee in his hand, looking every inch the successful businessman. He was younger than Caleb had expected, maybe 40, with carefully styled hair and clothes that came from somewhere far more sophisticated than Dry Creek. His face was pleasant, unremarkable, the kind you'd forget 5 minutes after meeting him, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, missing nothing. "Mr. Turner," Vane's voice was smooth, educated, carrying just enough warmth to seem friendly without being genuine. "And you must be Miss Cross. Yes, I remember you. You made quite a scene at your father's property transfer hearing." Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but her voice remained level. "I made a scene because you were stealing my father's ranch with forged documents." Strong accusation. Vane took a leisurely sip of coffee. The court didn't seem to agree, but I understand grief can cloud judgment, make people see conspiracy where there's only unfortunate legal reality. "Cut the performance," Caleb said, moving farther into the room. "We're not here for your polite lies. We know what you're doing, know about the forged notary seals and the fake contracts. What we don't know yet is why you think you'll get away with it." Something flickered in Vane's expression. Surprise, perhaps, that someone had identified the fraud so quickly. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by amused condescension. "Mr. Turner, I'm a legitimate businessman operating entirely within the bounds of the law. I acquire properties from people who, unfortunately, have failed to meet their legal obligations. If you have evidence of fraud, I'm sure the authorities would be interested, but accusations without proof are just noise." He set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Now, was there something specific you wanted to discuss, or did you simply come to waste my time with conspiracy theories?" "I came to tell you that you're not getting my ranch," Caleb said quietly, "or Bill Hendricks's ranch, or Tom Whitmore's, or anyone else's in this valley. Whatever scheme you're running, it ends here." Vane studied him for a long moment, and when he spoke again, the friendly facade had dropped entirely. "You know what your problem is, Mr. Turner? You think because you've lived here your whole life, because you've broken your back on hard ground, that somehow entitles you to keep what you have. But the world doesn't work that way. The world belongs to people who understand that everything, land, loyalty, even grief, is just capital to be leveraged." "Is that what you tell yourself when you're stealing from people who've lost everything?" Elena's voice was cold as January wind. "I don't steal anything. I simply recognize opportunities that others are too sentimental or too stupid to see. Your father, for instance, he could have sold to me voluntarily, taken a fair price, maintained some dignity. Instead, he fought and lost everything anyway. At least he taught you a valuable lesson about the cost of resistance." The words hit Elena like physical blows, and Caleb saw her take a half step forward before catching herself. He put a hand on her arm, gentle but firm, keeping her from doing something that would play into Vane's hands. "We're done here," Caleb said, turning toward the door. "Enjoy your coffee, Vane. You won't be drinking it in Dry Creek much longer." "Actually, Mr. Turner, before you go," Vane's voice stopped them at the threshold. "You should know that I've already initiated the documentation process for your property. You'll be receiving papers within the week. Given your emotional state since your wife's passing, I imagine the court will be quite sympathetic to arguments that you've been unable to properly manage your obligations. Grief is a terrible thing. It makes people careless." Caleb turned slowly, and something in his face made Vane take an involuntary step backward. For 3 years, Caleb had been numb, hollowed out, barely alive. But standing in this room, listening to this man weaponize Sarah's death as part of his con, Caleb felt something ignite inside him that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with pure, focused rage. "You want to use my wife's death as part of your schemes?" His voice was quiet, almost conversational, which somehow made it more frightening. "Go ahead and try. But understand this. I've already lost everything that mattered to me, which means I have absolutely nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing to lose is the most dangerous kind of enemy you can make." He left before Vane could respond, Elena following close behind. They didn't speak until they were back on the street, the hotel door swinging shut behind them. "That was either very brave or very stupid," Elena said, her voice shaking slightly with residual anger. "Probably both." Caleb's hands were trembling, adrenaline still coursing through his system. "But now we know for certain what we're dealing with, and he knows we're not going to fold without a fight." He also knows we're investigating him. We've lost the element of surprise. Maybe, but we've gained something too. We've rattled him. Did you see his face when I mentioned the forged seals? He wasn't expecting us to know that level of detail, which means he's going to make mistakes, going to rush his timeline to try to shut us down before we can build a case. Elena considered this, then nodded slowly. Rushed operations create opportunities for error. If we're lucky, he'll get sloppy. We'll need more than luck. We need Samuel Rourke. Caleb pulled out the map Jacob had drawn. 30 miles east. If we ride hard, we can be there before nightfall. And if he won't help us? Then we find another way. But we're running out of time, Elena. You heard Vane. He's already preparing papers for my ranch. Once he starts the legal process, even if we prove fraud eventually, the damage might already be done. Property sold, people displaced, lives destroyed. They retrieved their horses and were preparing to leave town when a voice called out from across the street. Bill Hendricks hurried toward them, his face flushed with exertion and anxiety. Caleb, wait. Need to tell you something. Bill glanced around nervously, then lowered his voice. The Albertson brothers just took Vane's offer, sold their ranch for pennies on the dollar rather than fight the legal claims. Word is spreading fast. Tom Whitmore's wife is pushing him to do the same, doesn't want to risk losing everything in court. Caleb felt his stomach drop. The dam was breaking, just as Jacob had warned. How much did Vane offer them? $5,000 for a spread worth at least $30,000. But they were scared, didn't have the money to fight, and Vane made it sound like the alternative was losing everything with nothing to show for it. Bill's voice cracked. Caleb, if the Albertsons are selling, others will follow. Fear's contagious. Once people start thinking resistance is futile, then we have to give them something to hope for, Elena cut in. Bill, spread the word quietly, to people you trust. Tell them we're working on proving the documents are fraudulent, but we need time. Tell them to hold off on any decisions for 72 hours. Can you do that? I can try, but Caleb, you better have something concrete in 3 days because after that, people are going to panic. Bill hesitated. There's something else. I heard Vane's got a meeting scheduled tomorrow afternoon with Judge Morrison. Don't know what it's about, but it can't be good. Judge Morrison handled most property disputes in the region, operating out of a circuit court that covered 3 counties. If Vane was meeting with him privately, it suggested either Morrison was complicit in the scheme or Vane was working to corrupt him. We'll be back before then, Caleb said with more confidence than he felt. Whatever Vane's planning, we'll stop it. They left Dry Creek at a gallop, the urgency of the situation driving them faster than was probably wise on the rough trail east. The landscape gradually changed as they rode, the grasslands giving way to more broken terrain, rocky outcrops, stands of pine, narrow creek beds that ran dry for most of the year. This was harder country, less hospitable to ranching, which probably explained why Samuel Rourke had chosen it for his retirement. They rode in focused silence for hours, both lost in their own thoughts. Caleb found himself thinking about Sarah, about how she would have handled this crisis. Sarah had been the strategic thinker in their partnership, the one who saw 3 moves ahead while Caleb was still figuring out the first. She would have known exactly how to dismantle Vane's operation, would have identified the weak points and exploited them with surgical precision. But Sarah was gone, and Caleb had to figure this out on his own. Well, not entirely on his own. He glanced at Elena, noting the determined set of her jaw, the way her eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for potential threats. Whatever else she was proving to be exactly the kind of ally he needed. Tell me about your father, Caleb said as they paused to water the horses at a small creek. Elena looked surprised by the question, then thoughtful. He was solid. That's the word that comes to mind. Not flashy, not particularly ambitious beyond wanting to run a good ranch and raise his family right, but solid. The kind of man who said what he meant and meant what he said. When he gave his word, it was ironclad. Sounds like someone worth fighting for. He was. Still is, though he doesn't really understand what happened. The stroke affected his memory, his comprehension. Some days he thinks he's still on the ranch, gets agitated when I try to explain we lost it. Other days he just stares out the window and doesn't speak at all. Her voice thickened with emotion. That's what Vane did. Didn't just take the land, he took my father's mind, his sense of self, everything he built his identity around. We're going to make this right, Caleb said, whatever it takes. You can't promise that. No, but I can promise I'll die trying, and sometimes that's enough. They rode on as the afternoon wore toward evening, finally spotting the painted fence Samuel Rourke had apparently installed as his declaration of civilization in the wilderness. The cabin beyond it was small but well-maintained, with a neat garden and a sturdy corral holding 2 horses. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting Rourke was home. As they approached, Caleb heard the distinctive sound of a shotgun being cocked. "That's far enough." The voice came from the shadow of the porch, where a figure emerged holding the promised shotgun with easy familiarity. Samuel Rourke was in his 60s, Caleb guessed, with iron gray hair and eyes that had spent decades evaluating lies and liars. "State your business and make it quick. I don't like unexpected visitors." Caleb raised his hand slowly, making no threatening moves. "My name is Caleb Turner. This is Elena Cross. We're here because we need help from someone who knows about fraudulent land documents." "Then you've wasted a ride. I'm retired." "People are losing their ranches to a con man named Marcus Vane," Elena said, her voice carrying across the distance. "He's using forged notary seals and fake contracts to steal properties all across the valley. My father lost everything to the same scheme 6 months ago. If we can't stop Vane now, dozens more families will lose their homes." Rourke's expression didn't change, but the shotgun lowered slightly. "Vane? You said? Marcus Vane? You know him?" Caleb felt a surge of hope. "Know of him. There's a difference." Rourke studied them for a long moment, then seemed to reach some internal decision. "You can come in, but leave your weapons on the porch, and if you try anything stupid, you'll regret it." They dismounted and did as instructed, following Rourke into a cabin that was surprisingly comfortable, shelves lined with books, a good stove, furniture that showed care and craftsmanship. Rourke gestured them to chairs while he remained standing, the shotgun now resting against the wall but still within easy reach. "Talk," he said simply. Elena pulled out Bill's documents and spread them on the table, then launched into a detailed explanation of the pattern she'd identified. The identical notary seals, the 2 consistent ink, the suspicious timing of supposedly decades-old contracts, all coming to light simultaneously. Caleb watched Rourke's face as she spoke, saw the way his eyes narrowed with professional interest despite his apparent reluctance. When Elena finished, Rourke picked up one of the documents and held it to the lamplight, examining it with the focus of someone who'd spent a career doing exactly this kind of analysis. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to a magnifying glass on the shelf. At Elena's nod, he retrieved it and bent over the papers, silent for several minutes as he examined seals, signatures, paper quality, ink composition. Finally he straightened, his expression grim. "You're right. These are forgeries, and fairly sophisticated ones. The notary seal is the most obvious tell. It's from a stamp rather than an embosser, which means someone created it specifically for this purpose. The ink is modern, probably less than a year old despite claims these documents are decades old. And the paper, he held a sheet up to the light again. "This is current stock from a Helena supplier. I'd recognize their watermark anywhere." "Can you prove it?" Caleb asked. "In court, with testimony that would stand up to legal scrutiny?" Rourke set down the document carefully. "I can. The question is whether I will." "Why wouldn't you?" Elena's voice rose with frustration. "You just said these are obvious forgeries. People are losing everything based on lies. I spent 30 years of my life dealing with property disputes, land fraud, and every variation of human greed and desperation you can imagine. It wore me down to nothing. That's why I'm here, in the middle of nowhere, specifically to get away from all of it." Rourke's voice was tired but firm. "I sympathize with your situation. I truly do. But I'm done being the person who rides in to save the day." Caleb felt their last hope slipping away, felt the weight of Bill's fear and the Albertsons' surrender, and Vane's smug confidence pressing down on him. He stood slowly, meeting Rourke's eyes directly. "You're right," Caleb said quietly. "You don't owe us anything. You put in your time, earned your peace. But I need you to understand something. In 3 days, maybe less, Marcus Vane is going to steal my ranch using documents just like these. Not because I failed or couldn't pay my debts, but because he's betting that no one will fight hard enough to stop him. And he's probably right. Most people can't afford lawyers, can't afford to lose what little they have fighting a battle they might not win. He gestured to Elena. Her father already lost that fight. Had a stroke from the stress and betrayal of it. He's alive but broken, and she's been wandering for 6 months trying to find someone who gives enough of a damn to help her prove what was done to him was wrong. Caleb's voice hardened. My wife died 3 years ago, and for 3 years I've been barely alive, just going through motions. But these past 2 days, fighting this fight, I've felt more alive than I have since I buried her. Not because I enjoy conflict, but because for the first time in years, I have something worth fighting for. And if we lose, if Vane wins, it won't just be land we lose. It'll be the idea that justice matters, that right counts for something, that ordinary people can stand against the bastards who think everything in the world is theirs for the taking. The cabin fell silent, except for the crackle of the fire. Rourke stood motionless, his face unreadable, and Caleb felt the moment stretching out like wire under tension. Finally, Rourke sighed deeply and moved to a cabinet, pulling out a worn leather satchel. I said I didn't want to save the day anymore. Didn't say I wouldn't. He began selecting tools from a drawer, specialized magnifying equipment, chemical testing supplies, documentation guides. But understand this, if I do this, we do it right. Full forensic examination, detailed report, testimony that will hold up under the most aggressive cross-examination. No shortcuts, no assumptions, we prove this fraud beyond any possible doubt. Elena's face transformed with relief and gratitude. Thank you. You don't know what this means. I know exactly what it means. It means I'm going to spend the next 72 hours fighting people I thought I'd never have to deal with again. It means I'm going to make enemies of whoever's backing Vane's operation. It means my quiet retirement just ended. Rourke's mouth quirked in something that might have been a smile. But it also means maybe I can sleep at night again, which is worth something. He spread the documents across a larger table and lit additional lamps, flooding the room with bright light. Now, you said there are other ranchers who've received similar papers. I'll need to examine all of them, look for patterns in the forgeries. The more examples we have, the stronger the case. We can get them, Caleb said. Bill Hendricks, Tom Whitmore, others. Good. Bring them here tomorrow morning early. I'll work through the night on these. He gestured to the documents already spread before him. By the time you return, I should have preliminary findings we can start building into formal testimony. They left Rourke bent over his examination table, completely absorbed in his work, the shotgun forgotten against the wall. As they rode back toward Dry Creek through the gathering darkness, Caleb felt something he'd almost forgotten, the sensation of momentum, of pieces falling into place, of a plan actually working. We might actually pull this off, Elena said, echoing his thoughts. Maybe. But Vane's not going to sit idle while we build a case. We rattled him this morning. He's going to move against us somehow. Let him try. There was steel in Elena's voice. We've got truth on our side now, and an expert who can prove it. All we need is 3 days. They made camp that night in a sheltered draw, too far from either Rourke's cabin or Dry Creek to safely reach in darkness. As they sat by the fire, eating cold provisions and planning their next moves, Caleb found himself studying Elena across the flames. Why are you really doing this? He asked. Not just for your father. You could have moved on, started over somewhere new. Why keep fighting a battle you already lost? Elena was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but unwavering. Because if I don't, then what Vane did to us becomes just another story of people getting crushed by the system. Another example of how the world belongs to whoever has the best lawyers and the least conscience. And I refuse, absolutely refuse, to let that be the end of my father's story, or mine. She looked up, meeting his eyes. Some fights you can't walk away from, even if you lose. Because walking away means accepting that wrong is stronger than right, that cruelty wins and kindness is for fools. I won't accept that. I can't. Caleb nodded slowly, understanding in a way he couldn't quite articulate. They were the same kind of stubborn, he and Elena, the kind that would keep swinging even when beaten, would keep standing even when broken, because the alternative was surrender to a world that devoured the weak and rewarded the vicious. "Tomorrow we ride back to Dry Creek," Caleb said. "Gather the other documents. Get them to Rourke. Then we find out what Vane's planning with Judge Morrison and make sure it doesn't happen." 3 days, Elena said. "That's all we need. 3 days to save the valley." 3 days to prove that sometimes the good guys win, Caleb agreed. They settled into their bedrolls as the fire burned down to embers, and for the first time in 3 years, Caleb fell asleep with something besides grief filling his thoughts. The fight ahead would be hard, possibly dangerous, and they might still lose. But they had a chance now, a real chance. And sometimes, Caleb thought as sleep took him, a chance was all you needed to turn the tide. The eastern sky was just beginning to pale when Caleb jerked awake, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that lay beside his bedroll. The sound that had pulled him from sleep came again, hoofbeats, moving fast, coming from the direction of town. Elena was already on her feet, her own weapon ready, her eyes scanning the darkness beyond their dying campfire. A single rider emerged from the pre-dawn gloom, pushing his horse harder than was wise on unfamiliar terrain. As he drew closer, Caleb recognized Tom Whitmore, his face pale with exhaustion and fear. "Caleb!" Tom practically fell from his saddle, his legs unsteady after what must have been hours of hard riding. "Thank heaven I found you. Jacob said you'd headed east, so I just kept riding and hoping." "What happened?" Caleb was already moving, helping Tom to the fire, noting the way the man's hands shook as he accepted water from Elena's canteen. Vane moved up his timeline. "Yesterday afternoon, right after you left town, he served papers to 6 more ranchers. Not 30 days like he gave the rest of us. These said 10 days. And this morning, before dawn, he had a meeting with Judge Morrison at the courthouse." Tom's voice cracked with desperation. "Caleb, Morrison signed an order. Emergency seizure authorization based on imminent risk of property damage or disposal of assets. It means Vane can take possession of any disputed property immediately, pending final court hearings." Elena swore softly, her face hardening. "That's not standard legal procedure. Morrison had to be bribed or threatened to sign something like that." "Doesn't matter if he was or wasn't," Tom said bitterly. "The order's legal until someone challenges it successfully, and by the time that happens, Vane will have sold off everything that matters. Cattle, equipment, anything portable. He's got buyers lined up already. I heard him bragging about it at the hotel." Caleb felt the careful plan they'd constructed beginning to crumble. 3 days had seemed tight but manageable. Now they had hours, maybe less, before Vane started seizing properties. "How many ranchers are affected by Morrison's order?" he asked, his mind already racing ahead to possible counters. "At least 8 that I know of. Could be more by now. Vane's been busy while the rest of us slept." Tom looked between Caleb and Elena with desperate hope. "Tell me you've got something. Tell me this ride wasn't for nothing." "We found someone who can prove the documents are forgeries," Elena said. "A federal land examiner, retired but willing to testify. But he needs time to do a proper forensic analysis, build a case that will hold up in court." "We don't have time!" Tom's voice rose toward panic. "Don't you understand? Vane's moving now, today. By sunset, he could have possession orders for half the valley." Caleb stood and began kicking dirt over the fire, his movements decisive despite the chaos of his thoughts. "Then we change tactics. We can't wait for Rourke to finish his analysis. We need to stop the seizures before they start." "How?" Elena was already packing their gear, matching his urgency. "Morrison's order is legal, even if it's corrupt. Even if we know Vane's whole operation is fraud, that piece of paper gives him the authority to act. Then we make sure he can't act on it." Caleb turned to Tom. "Where's Vane right now?" "Still at the hotel, last I saw. He's got those 2 men with him, the lawyer and the other one, the dangerous-looking fellow. They were planning to head out mid-morning to start serving the possession orders personally. An idea was forming in Caleb's mind, risky and possibly insane, but the only play he could see that might buy them the time they needed. "Tom, ride back to town. Find Bill Hendricks. Find everyone who's been served papers by Vane. Get them together at the church by 9 o'clock. Tell them to bring their documents, and tell them to bring whatever fight they've got left. What are you planning? I'm planning to make Marcus Vane's life very difficult for the next 72 hours. Caleb was already saddling his horse, Elena doing the same without needing to be told. If we can't stop him legally, we'll stop him practically. Make it so hard for him to seize properties that he'll be forced to slow down. And while he's dealing with us, Rourke finishes building the case that destroys him permanently. Tom looked uncertain, but desperate enough to grab at any hope. The sheriff's not going to like this. Whatever you're planning, if it involves interfering with a court order, then Sheriff Mallory can arrest me after we've saved the valley. Now ride, Tom. We're running out of darkness. Tom remounted and spurred his horse back toward Dry Creek, disappearing into the fading night. Caleb and Elena followed at a more measured pace, and as they rode, Caleb could feel Elena's eyes on him, questioning. "You want to tell me what brilliant plan is forming in that stubborn head of yours?" she asked. Vane's strength is his legal authority. The papers, the court order, the appearance of legitimacy. But that only works if people accept it. What if we organize the ranchers to peacefully resist? Not violence, but just collective refusal to comply. Make every single property seizure take hours instead of minutes. Require him to physically evict people in front of witnesses. Turn this from a quiet legal process into a public spectacle. Elena considered this, her expression thoughtful. It's not a long-term solution. Eventually, the law will enforce Morrison's order, peacefully or otherwise. I know, but it buys us time, and time is what Rourke needs. Plus, it forces Vane to show his true colors. Hard to maintain the fiction that you're just a legitimate businessman when you're dragging families out of their homes. Caleb glanced at her. You think it's a terrible idea. I think it's a dangerous idea that could get people hurt, but I also think it might be our only option. She paused. The key is keeping it peaceful. The moment someone throws a punch or draws a weapon, Vane wins. He gets to call in federal marshals, paint the ranchers as lawless vigilantes, and everything we're trying to accomplish falls apart. Then we make sure everyone understands the rules. Passive resistance only. Make Vane work for every inch, but don't give him an excuse to escalate to violence. They reached Dry Creek as the sun cleared the horizon, painting the main street in shades of amber and gold that belied the tension crackling through the town. Small groups of ranchers were already gathering near the church, word having spread with the speed that only true crisis could generate. Caleb counted at least 20 people, with more arriving every few minutes. Not just the ranch owners, but their wives, their older children, friends and neighbors who understood that Vane's predation threatened the entire fabric of their community. Bill Hendricks met them in the street, his face haggard from a sleepless night, but his eyes carrying new determination. Tom told us what you're planning. It's crazy, Caleb. Sheriff's already been by, warning that interfering with legal property seizures is a crime. Where's Mallory now? At his office, probably praying this whole situation goes away without him having to actually do anything. Bill's voice carried bitter contempt for the sheriff's passivity. He's a good man in his way, but he's not built for standing up to the kind of pressure Vane can bring to bear. Then we don't rely on him. We rely on ourselves. Caleb dismounted and moved toward the church steps, raising his voice to address the growing crowd. Listen up. You all know why we're here. Marcus Vane has court authorization to seize your property starting today. And if we let him do it unopposed, by this time tomorrow half of you won't have homes. Anxious murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone called out, "What can we do? The law is on his side." The law's been corrupted, Elena said, stepping forward. Those documents Vane's using are forgeries, fake notary seals, manufactured debts, lies dressed up in legal language. We have proof, and we have an expert witness who can testify to it. But we need time for him to complete his analysis, and for us to get this in front of a legitimate court. So you want us to break the law? This from Sarah Chen, her face drawn with worry. I can't afford to get arrested, can't afford legal troubles on top of everything else. Not break the law, Caleb clarified. Just slow it down. When Vane comes to seize your property, you comply, eventually. But you ask questions, you review paperwork carefully, you require proper identification, you insist on reading every word of every document. You make the process take hours instead of minutes, and you make sure there are witnesses to everything, neighbors, friends, people who can testify later about how this was conducted. He could see understanding beginning to dawn on faces in the crowd, fear giving way to something harder and more useful. "We stand together," Bill said, his voice growing stronger. "When Vane comes for one ranch, we all go there. Safety in numbers and witnesses in numbers. Make it so he can't isolate anyone, can't pressure people when they're alone and scared." Tom Whitmore pushed through the crowd. "I'll do it. When he comes for my place, I'll make him work for every signature, every piece of paper. Won't lift a finger to help him steal what my grandfather built." Others began voicing agreement, the energy in the crowd shifting from defeated anxiety to something closer to defiance. Caleb felt it building, felt the community finding its collective spine, and knew they had a chance, slim but real. "There are rules," Elena said firmly, her voice cutting through the growing noise. "No weapons, no violence, no threats. The moment anyone crosses that line, Vane wins and we all lose. This only works if we stay on the right side of the law, even when the law is being used against us." "What about Vane's men?" someone asked. "That one he travels with, the dangerous-looking one. What if he starts something?" "Then we document it, we testify to it, and we use it against him later," Caleb said. "But we don't respond in kind. Remember, we're not trying to win today's battle with force. We're buying time to win tomorrow's battle with truth." The church bell began to toll 9 o'clock, and as if summoned by the sound, a commotion arose from the direction of the hotel. Marcus Vane emerged onto the street, flanked by his 2 associates, the lawyer carrying his ever-present document case, and the other man whose hand rested too casually near his hip in a way that suggested a concealed weapon. Vane spotted the crowd and stopped, his expression shifting from confident to wary. For a long moment, the entire street seemed to hold its breath, 2 groups facing each other across dusty ground like armies before a battle. Then Vane started walking toward them, his stride deliberately casual, his face arranging itself into a pleasant smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well," he said as he approached, his voice carrying that same smooth charm he had displayed in the hotel room. "This is quite the gathering. What's the occasion?" "You are," Caleb said flatly. "We know about the emergency seizure order. Know you're planning to start taking properties today. We're here to make sure you do it by the book, with witnesses and proper procedure." Something dangerous flickered in Vane's expression before the mask of civility returned. "I always operate by the book, Mr. Turner. That's why I have the law on my side, and you have—" "What exactly? A mob?" "A community," Elena corrected. "People who've built their lives here, who have every right to witness and verify the legal processes being used to take their homes." Vane's lawyer stepped forward, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the pinched expression of someone who'd spent too much time reading contracts. "This is intimidation, plain and simple. We have legal authority to execute possession orders without interference. If you persist in this obstruction, we'll have no choice but to involve federal authorities." "Involve whoever you want," Bill said. "We're not stopping you from doing anything. We're just watching you do it. Last I checked, that wasn't illegal." The third man, the one Caleb had mentally labeled as security, leaned close to Vane and whispered something. Vane listened, nodded once, then turned back to address the crowd. "Fine. You want to waste your day following me around, watching me conduct legal business? Be my guest. But understand this. Every hour you spend playing these games is an hour you could spend preparing for the inevitable. Your resistance is theatrical and ultimately pointless." He pulled a list from his pocket. "First property on today's agenda is the Whitmore Ranch. We'll be heading there within the hour. Anyone who wishes to observe is welcome to ride along." With that, he turned and walked back toward the hotel, his associates following. The crowd watched him go, and Caleb could feel the mixture of relief and apprehension. They'd drawn a line, but now they had to hold it. "Tom," Caleb said quietly, "ride ahead to your ranch. Warn your wife what's coming. Make sure she understands the plan. Cooperate slowly, document everything. Don't give them any excuse to claim obstruction." Tom nodded and hurried toward his horse. Others in the crowd began organizing, deciding who would ride to the Whitmore place and who would stay in town to watch for Vane's next moves. The community was mobilizing with the efficiency of people who'd spent their lives dealing with crisis and uncertainty. Elena pulled Caleb aside, her voice low and urgent. "This is going to work for maybe a day, 2 at most. Vane will get a court order specifically prohibiting this kind of mass witnessing, or he'll find some other legal maneuver we haven't anticipated. We need Rourke's analysis finished and in front of a legitimate judge as soon as possible. I know. I'll ride to Rourke's cabin this afternoon, see how far he's gotten, bring him any additional documents we can gather. Caleb glanced toward the hotel, where Vane was visible through a window, gesturing animatedly in what looked like an angry conversation with his associates. But for now, we've disrupted his timeline, made him react to us instead of the other way around. That's something. It's something, Elena agreed. Question is whether it's enough. The ride to the Whitmore Ranch became a procession, nearly 30 people on horseback, following Vane's small party at a careful distance. Tom's spread was about 5 miles north of town, good grazing land with a reliable creek and a modest house that had sheltered 3 generations of Whitmores. As they approached, Caleb could see Tom and his wife Margaret standing on the porch, their teenage son beside them, all 3 wearing expressions of determined anxiety. Vane dismounted with theatrical courtesy, his lawyer already pulling documents from the case. The crowd of ranchers formed a loose semicircle, close enough to witness everything but far enough to avoid accusations of physical interference. Mr. Whitmore, Vane began, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of a funeral director. I'm here to execute a court-authorized possession order for this property, effective immediately. If you'll just sign these transfer documents, we can keep this civilized and efficient. Tom took the papers but didn't look at them, instead meeting Vane's eyes directly. I'd like to review these carefully before signing anything. That's my legal right, isn't it? A muscle twitched in Vane's jaw. Of course. Take all the time you need. Tom sat down on the porch steps and began reading, his finger tracing each line with exaggerated care. Minutes ticked by in tense silence. Vane's pleasant expression gradually hardened into irritation. Mr. Whitmore, these are standard documents. Surely you don't need to— I'm protecting my rights, Tom interrupted mildly, making sure I understand exactly what I'm signing. You wouldn't want me to claim later that I was rushed or coerced, would you? Vane's lawyer intervened. Perhaps if we explained the key provisions. I'd prefer to read them myself, thank you. After all, this is my home we're talking about, my family's legacy. Seems worth a thorough review. Caleb watched the exchange with grim satisfaction. Tom was executing the plan perfectly, completely compliant on the surface, but turning what should have been a 5-minute transaction into an extended ordeal. Behind Vane, the crowd of witnesses stood silent, their presence a constant reminder that this wasn't happening in the shadows. An hour passed. Then another. Tom read through the documents 3 times, asked detailed questions about specific clauses, requested clarification on legal terminology. His wife brought out lemonade for the witnesses, a gesture that was both hospitable and perfectly calculated to further slow the proceedings. By noon, Vane was visibly frustrated, his smooth facade cracking. This is ridiculous. You're deliberately wasting time. I'm being careful, Tom replied evenly. If you'd prefer to come back tomorrow when I've had a chance to consult with— No. The word came out sharper than Vane probably intended. He took a breath, visibly composing himself. No, we'll finish this today. But today dragged on. By mid-afternoon, Tom had finally signed the initial documents, but then his wife wanted to review them as well, as was her legal right as co-owner. The teenage son, technically a minor but old enough to have opinions, insisted on understanding what was happening to his family home. Through it all, the crowd of witnesses remained, silent and watchful. Several of them took notes, documenting times, statements, the increasingly hostile tone from Vane and his associates. Caleb saw neighbors taking photographs with small cameras, capturing evidence that could be used later. It was nearly sunset when the possession paperwork was finally completed. 6 hours to seize one property, a process that should have taken 30 minutes at most. As Vane climbed back onto his horse, his face was dark with barely controlled rage. Congratulations, he said, his voice dripping venom. You've managed to delay the inevitable by a few hours. I hope you're proud of yourselves. We're just making sure everything's done properly, Bill called out. You know, by the book and all. Vane's security man shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward his hip, but Vane stopped him with a sharp gesture. For a moment, Caleb thought violence might erupt anyway, thought the careful balance they'd maintained would shatter. But then Vane turned his horse and rode toward town without another word, leaving behind a property he now technically possessed, but at a cost that clearly infuriated him. As the crowd began to disperse, Tom approached Caleb, exhaustion and relief mixing on his face. "That was the hardest thing I've ever done, standing there being polite while that bastard stole my home. But we did it. We made him work for it, made him show his true nature in front of witnesses. You did perfectly," Elena said. "Every question you asked, every minute you took, that's all documented now. When this goes to court, that documentation matters." Margaret Whitmore hugged her husband, tears streaming down her face. "What happens now? We've signed the papers. Do we have to leave?" "The possession order gives Vane legal ownership, but he still has to follow eviction procedures if he wants you physically gone," Caleb explained. "That's another legal process, more time, more opportunities to fight. And meanwhile, we're building the case that will invalidate all of this." He hoped he sounded more confident than he felt. The truth was they'd won a tactical victory, but the strategic situation remained dire. Vane had one property now, and tomorrow he'd come for the next one. And the one after that. Eventually, exhaustion and fear would break the ranchers' unity. As twilight descended, Caleb pulled Elena aside. "I need to ride to Rourke's cabin tonight, see where he stands with the analysis. Can you stay here, help coordinate if Vane tries to seize more properties tomorrow?" "You shouldn't ride alone. Vane's furious. He might do something stupid." "I'll be careful. But we're running out of time, and sitting around waiting isn't going to help." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Besides, if something does happen to me, you need to be here to keep this going. You know what's at stake better than anyone." Elena's expression hardened with understanding and reluctant acceptance. "Fine. But you take a rifle, you stay off the main trails, and if you're not back by dawn, I'm coming to find you." "Deal." He rode out as full darkness fell, taking a circuitous route that added miles but kept him away from roads where Vane or his men might be traveling. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead in the way they only got this far from cities and their lights. Caleb let his horse pick its way carefully through the darkness, trusting the animal's senses more than his own. His mind churned through the day's events, analyzing what they'd accomplished and what still needed doing. They'd proven the ranchers could organize effective resistance, had demonstrated that Vane's operation wasn't going to roll over the valley unopposed, but they'd also shown their hand, given Vane time to prepare countermeasures. Tomorrow would be harder, the next day harder still. Everything depended on Rourke finishing his forensic analysis, building an ironclad case that could be presented to a judge who wasn't corrupt or intimidated. But even that assumed they could find such a judge, assumed the legal system wasn't so thoroughly compromised that truth didn't matter anymore. Caleb pushed the doubts aside. Doubt was a luxury they couldn't afford right now. They had to believe that justice still meant something, that evidence and truth could overcome lies and legal manipulation. Because if that wasn't true, then everything they were fighting for was already lost. Rourke's cabin appeared through the darkness, lamplight glowing warm through the windows. Caleb dismounted and knocked, announcing himself clearly so he didn't get shot by a startled hermit. Rourke opened the door, looking like he hadn't slept since they'd left him. His eyes were red-rimmed with fatigue, his desk buried under documents and analysis equipment, but his expression carried fierce satisfaction. "Good timing," he said without preamble. "I've found something you need to see." He led Caleb to the table where documents were spread out with various notes and markings in different colored inks. Rourke picked up a magnifying glass and pointed to a notary seal on one of the papers. "Look at this carefully. See that tiny imperfection in the letter R of the notary's name? It's on every single document Vane has filed. Every single one. Over a span of supposedly 20 years, covering multiple notaries in different counties, and yet this exact same microscopic flaw appears consistently." Caleb leaned closer, seeing what Rourke was indicating, a barely visible break in the curved line of the letter, so small he'd never have noticed it without specific guidance. It means all these documents, despite claims they were notarized by different officials across 2 decades, were actually created using the same forged stamp. It's irrefutable proof of systematic fraud. Rourke's voice carried the quiet triumph of a man who'd spent his career catching liars and had just caught another. But it gets better. I've been cross-referencing the claim notarization dates with public records. 3 of the notaries who supposedly signed these documents were dead on the dates listed. Dead, buried, and yet their seals appear on current legal filings. That's impossible to explain away, Caleb breathed. Impossible for Vane, yes, which is why this evidence will destroy him completely. Rourke gathered several documents into a folder. I'm preparing formal testimony and analysis that I can present to any legitimate court. But Caleb, you need to understand, this will make powerful people very angry. Whoever's backing Vane's operation, they've invested significant resources into this scheme. When it collapses, they're going to look for someone to blame. Let them blame me. I'll wear it like a badge. Caleb felt hope surging through his exhaustion. How soon can you have everything ready? Already done. I've been working nonstop since you left. I have documentation, analysis, formal affidavits, everything a court would need to invalidate every claim Vane has filed. He handed Caleb a thick envelope sealed with wax. These are copies of my findings. Keep them safe, separate from the originals. If anything happens to me or to the primary documentation, nothing's going to happen, Caleb interrupted. But even as he said it, he knew they were both thinking about how desperate men did desperate things. I'll ride into Dry Creek tomorrow morning, Rourke continued. We'll present this to Sheriff Mallory, demand he arrest Vane for fraud, and suspend any seizures pending a full investigation. With this evidence, even Mallory can't ignore what's happening. What about Judge Morrison? He signed the emergency order. Rourke's expression darkened. Morrison's either corrupt or incompetent, possibly both. We'll need to get this in front of a district judge, someone with authority to overrule Morrison and investigate his involvement. That means Helena, which means more time. Time we don't have. Vane seized the Whitmore Ranch today. Tomorrow, he'll go for more. Then we stop him tomorrow. We present this evidence publicly, in front of witnesses, in a way that makes it impossible for anyone to ignore or suppress. We force the confrontation now, while we have momentum. Rourke moved to a cabinet and pulled out a gun belt Caleb hadn't seen before. I said I was retired from this kind of work. Didn't say I was unprepared for it. But despite everything, Caleb found himself smiling. You really think we can pull this off? Stop Vane, save the ranches, actually win this thing? I think we have truth on our side, solid evidence, and the determination to see it through. That's more than most people ever have when fighting this kind of corruption. Rourke's voice softened slightly. And I think sometimes, when you stand up to bullies with nothing but facts and courage, you'd be surprised how fast they fold. Caleb left the cabin as midnight approached, the sealed envelope secured in his saddlebag like precious cargo. The ride back to Dry Creek felt different now, charged with possibility instead of just grim determination. They had what they needed. Tomorrow, the fight would truly begin. He was halfway back to town when he heard riders behind him, moving fast and with purpose. Caleb's hand went to his rifle as he guided his horse off the trail into a stand of trees, watching as 3 men thundered past in the darkness. He couldn't make out faces, but something about their urgency sent warning bells ringing through his mind. They were heading toward Rourke's cabin. For one frozen moment, Caleb debated his options. Ride to warn Rourke? Race to town to get help? Try to follow the men and see what they were planning? Every choice carried risks. Every delay could prove fatal. He chose warning over pursuit, wheeling his horse around and driving it hard back the way he'd come. The animal responded gamely despite its exhaustion, sensing its rider's urgency. Trees blurred past in the darkness, branches whipping at Caleb's face as he took a more direct route that was faster but dangerous. Rourke's cabin came into view still lit, still peaceful. Caleb was 50 yards away when the riders he'd seen earlier emerged from the shadows surrounding the property. They'd circled around, come from a different direction, and were now dismounting with the careful coordination of men executing a planned operation. "Rourke!" Caleb shouted, his voice tearing through the night quiet. "Get out! They're coming!" Lamps extinguished instantly inside the cabin. Caleb saw a window open on the far side, saw Rourke moving with surprising speed for a man his age. But the riders had anticipated escape routes. 2 of them were already circling the cabin, while the third kicked in the front door. Caleb fired his rifle into the air, a warning shot meant to scatter the attackers, or at least make them reconsider their approach. Instead, one of the men wheeled and fired back, the bullet whining past Caleb's head close enough that he felt the air displacement. Everything dissolved into chaos. Caleb threw himself from his horse, using the animal's bulk for cover while firing toward the cabin. He wasn't trying to hit anyone, wasn't even sure he could in the darkness, just trying to create enough confusion for Rourke to escape. More gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Muzzle flashes lit the night in strobe-like bursts. Caleb heard shouting, heard glass breaking, heard his horse whinny in panic and bolt away into the darkness. He was pinned down behind a fallen log now, outnumbered and outgunned, with no idea if Rourke had made it out or was trapped inside. Then, cutting through the chaos, came the sound of hoofbeats, more riders approaching fast. Caleb's heart sank. Reinforcements for the attackers would end this quickly and badly. But the new arrivals didn't join the assault on the cabin. Instead, they came in from the east, weapons already firing, forcing Vane's men to suddenly fight on two fronts. In the confused darkness, Caleb couldn't identify the newcomers until one of them shouted his name in a voice he recognized. Elena. She'd brought help. The attackers broke and ran, scrambling for their horses and disappearing into the night as quickly as they'd come. As silence fell again, broken only by heavy breathing and the nervous shifting of horses, Caleb stood cautiously from his cover. "Everyone alive?" Elena's voice called out from the darkness. "Here," Caleb responded. "Rourke?" A figure emerged from the trees beyond the cabin. Rourke, moving stiffly but intact, carrying a satchel that presumably held his precious documentation. "I'm fine. Got out the back window and into the woods before they breached the cabin. Heard the shooting and stayed hidden." Elena rode closer, and Caleb could now see she'd brought Bill and Tom, all three armed and looking like they'd ridden hard. "Saw riders leaving town in a hurry," she explained. "Had a bad feeling about it, so we followed. Good thing, too." "How much of Rourke's work did they get?" Bill asked, dismounting to approach the cabin cautiously. "None of the critical documents," Rourke said, patting his satchel. "I was preparing to leave anyway, had everything important packed and ready. They'll find copies and reference materials, but nothing that matters." His voice hardened. "But this proves how desperate Vane has become. He knows we're close to exposing him, so he's escalating to violence." "Which means we need to move faster than he does," Caleb said. "We ride back to Dry Creek tonight, present the evidence at first light in front of as many witnesses as possible, make it public before Vane can suppress it." "That's a lot of riding in one night," Tom observed. "Then we better get started." They rode through the darkness in a tight group, weapons ready, eyes scanning constantly for any sign of pursuit or ambush. But the night remained quiet except for the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional nightbird calling. Either Vane's men had abandoned their mission or they were regrouping for another attempt. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky, the lights of Dry Creek appeared ahead. The town was just beginning to wake, smoke rising from chimneys, the first early risers emerging to begin their days. They had no idea that in the next few hours everything would change. Caleb felt the weight of the sealed envelope in his saddlebag, felt the exhaustion of a sleepless night, and the adrenaline of survival still singing through his veins. They'd been attacked, nearly killed, but they'd protected what mattered. The evidence survived. The truth survived. Now they just had to make sure everyone heard it before Vane could silence them permanently. The group rode straight to the church, and by the time they dismounted, word was already spreading through Dry Creek like wildfire. People emerged from their homes and businesses, drawn by the sight of armed riders converging in the pre-dawn light and the unmistakable energy of something significant about to happen. Within 20 minutes, nearly 40 people had gathered on the church steps, their faces reflecting confusion, hope, and lingering fear from the previous day's confrontation. Caleb stood on the top step, Elena beside him, with Rourke holding his precious satchel like a shield against chaos. The morning sun was just beginning to crest the eastern hills, painting the assembled crowd in shades of gold and shadow. Caleb could see Sheriff Mallory pushing through the gathering, his face creased with worry and the weight of authority he wasn't sure he wanted to exercise. "Somebody better start explaining what's going on," Mallory said, his hand resting on his gun belt more from habit than threat. "I got reports of gunfire east of town last night, and now I find half the valley gathered here looking like they're about to start a war." "Not start one," Caleb said clearly, his voice carrying across the crowd. "End one." "Sheriff, this is Samuel Rourke, former federal land examiner. He spent the last 2 days analyzing the documents Marcus Vane has been using to seize properties across this valley. Mr. Rourke, would you like to share your findings? Rourke stepped forward, and despite his exhaustion and the trauma of the previous night's attack, his voice carried the absolute certainty of an expert presenting irrefutable facts. Every document Marcus Vane has filed claiming debts against ranchers in this valley is a forgery. The notary seals are fake, created from a single stamp rather than multiple legitimate embossers. The signatures are manufactured. The paper and ink are modern, not decades old as claimed. And most damningly, several documents bear notarization dates from officials who were already dead at the time they supposedly signed. A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Mallory's expression shifted from wary to genuinely stunned. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Rourke. You got proof?" "I have forensic analysis, photographic evidence, and documentation that would stand up in any legitimate court in this country." Rourke pulled documents from his satchel, holding them up for everyone to see. "I have 23 years of experience evaluating land fraud for the federal government, and I'm telling you with absolute certainty that Marcus Vane is running a systematic criminal operation designed to steal property through fabricated legal claims." "Then why hasn't this been exposed before?" someone in the crowd called out. "Why'd the courts accept these documents if they're so obviously fake?" "Because they're not obviously fake to someone without specialized training," Elena answered, stepping forward. "That's the genius and the evil of it. Vane uses real legal processes, real court procedures, genuine-looking documentation. Most judges, most sheriffs, most ordinary people don't have the expertise to spot sophisticated forgery. They see official seals and legal language and assume it's legitimate because why would anyone go to such lengths to lie?" "But we know now," Bill said from within the crowd. "We have proof, we have an expert witness, and we're not letting Vane steal one more acre of land in this valley." Mallory looked overwhelmed, caught between his duty to enforce legal orders and the mounting evidence that those orders were based on fraud. "Even if everything you're saying is true, I don't have the authority to just ignore a judge's order. Morrison signed that emergency seizure authorization. Morrison was either bribed or fooled," Rourke interrupted. "And given the sophistication of this operation, I'd bet money on bribed. This isn't some amateur con, Sheriff. This is organized crime operating under the cover of legal respectability. Someone with significant resources is backing Vane, providing forgers, lawyers, judges willing to look the other way." "Then we need to get this to someone who can do something about it," Mallory said. And for the first time, Caleb heard something like steel in the sheriff's voice. "District attorney, federal marshals, someone with the jurisdiction and the spine to take this on." "That takes time," Tom pointed out. "Days, maybe weeks. Meanwhile, Vane's still operating under Morrison's order. He could seize every property in the valley before any higher authority intervenes." "Not if we stop him ourselves," a woman's voice called out. Sarah Chen pushed through the crowd, her face set with determination. "Yesterday we showed we could slow him down with peaceful resistance. Today we show we can stop him completely. No cooperation, no compliance, nothing until this fraud is exposed officially and every one of Vane's claims is thrown out." The crowd's energy shifted, fear giving way to anger and anger crystallizing into resolve. Caleb could feel it building, could sense the community finding its collective strength. But he also felt the dangerous edge of it, the way righteous anger could tip into violence if not carefully managed. "Listen to me," he said, raising his voice to cut through the growing noise. "What Sarah's suggesting takes discipline. It means standing firm without crossing lines that would give Vane ammunition against us. No violence, no destruction of property, nothing that lets him paint us as lawless vigilantes instead of citizens defending their rights." "What about last night?" Mallory asked sharply. "I heard there was shooting at Rourke's cabin. That sound peaceful to you?" "That was Vane's men attacking us," Caleb said flatly. 3 riders, armed and operating in the dark, to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses. We defended ourselves, nothing more." "You got proof of that?" "We got Vane escalating to violence because he knows we're about to destroy his entire operation," Elena said. "Sheriff, which side are you going to be on when this goes public? The side of organized criminals stealing from honest people, or the side of your community defending itself?" Mallory's jaw worked silently, and Caleb could see the man wrestling with competing pressures. his oath to uphold the law versus his understanding that the law was being corrupted. Finally, the sheriff looked at Rourke directly. "These findings of yours, they solid enough to take to a federal prosecutor? Solid enough to send Marcus Vane to prison for the rest of his life," Rourke said without hesitation. "Then here's what's going to happen." Mallory's voice carried new authority, the voice of a man who'd finally decided which side he was on. "I'm going to ride to Helena myself today and present this evidence to the federal prosecutor's office. I'll request an emergency injunction halting all property seizures pending investigation. It'll take me most of the day to get there, maybe another day for the wheels to turn, but I'll get it done." "And in the meantime?" Bill asked. "In the meantime, I'm officially declaring that there's credible evidence of fraud affecting all land claims filed by Marcus Vane in this jurisdiction. As sheriff, I have the discretion to pause enforcement of disputed orders while seeking higher authority review. So I'm pausing them. Vane tries to seize another property before I get back from Helena with proper authority. He'll be doing it without my office's support." A cheer went up from the crowd, relief and vindication mixing into something almost joyful. Caleb felt his own tension easing slightly, though he knew Mallory's declaration wasn't a final victory, just a crucial turning point. As if summoned by the celebration, Marcus Vane emerged from the Grand Hotel, flanked as always by his lawyer and his security man. He stopped at the edge of the crowd, taking in the scene with narrowed eyes, and Caleb saw the moment when Vane understood that the situation had shifted fundamentally. "Sheriff Mallory," Vane called out, his voice carrying false cheer that fooled no one. "I hope this gathering isn't planning to interfere with legal proceedings. That would be unfortunate for everyone involved. Actually, Mr. Vane, I think you're the one who needs to worry about legal proceedings." Mallory stepped forward, and for all his earlier uncertainty, the sheriff now carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd finally found solid ground to stand on. "I've received credible evidence that the documents you've been using to claim property in this valley are fraudulent. I'm suspending enforcement of all seizure orders pending federal investigation." Vane's pleasant mask slipped, revealing cold fury beneath. "You don't have the authority to override a judge's order. I have the authority to request higher review when presented with evidence of fraud, which is exactly what I'm doing. You want to challenge that? Take it up with the federal prosecutor in Helena. I'll be heading there within the hour to do exactly that." "This is absurd." Vane's lawyer stepped forward, document case clutched like a weapon. "Sheriff, we have legitimate court orders, properly executed, with full legal authority. Some retired government clerk claiming to see irregularities doesn't negate months of proper legal process." "I'm not a clerk," Rourke said coldly. "I'm a federal land examiner with 2 decades of experience in fraud detection, and I can prove, in any court you want to name, that every single document you filed is a forgery created using stolen notary seals and fabricated signatures, including signatures from officials who were dead at the time they supposedly signed." The lawyer's face went pale. Vane's hand shot out, gripping his associate's arm in a gesture that clearly meant, "Shut up." For several heartbeats, the two groups faced each other across the dusty street, the ranchers and their allies on one side, Vane and his operation on the other, with the sheriff standing literally and figuratively between them. "This isn't over," Vane said finally, his voice stripped of all pretense of charm. "You think you've won something here today, but you have no idea who you're dealing with. No idea what resources stand behind me. This little valley is nothing, and you're nothing, and when the dust settles, I'll own every acre of land from here to the horizon." "Big talk from a man whose entire scheme just collapsed," Elena said. "You're done, Vane. Maybe not arrested yet, maybe not in prison yet, but done. The evidence is documented, the witnesses are lined up, and the truth is out. You can bluster all you want, but the only question now is how long before federal marshals show up to put you in chains." Vane's security man shifted his stance, his hand drifting toward his hip, and suddenly the air crackled with the potential for violence. Caleb's hand moved to his own weapon, others in the crowd doing the same, everyone balanced on the edge of something that could turn bloody in an instant. "Don't!" Mallory's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're planning to do, don't. Because if shooting starts, I guarantee you'll be the ones going to jail, not these ranchers defending their homes." The moment stretched out, taut as a wire under load. Then Vane made a sharp gesture and turned away, walking back toward the hotel with his associates following. But as he reached the door, he looked back at the assembled crowd, his eyes finding Caleb. "You've made a powerful enemy today, Turner. Hope you're prepared for the consequences." "Already lost everything that mattered to me once," Caleb called back. "Consequences don't scare me anymore." Vane disappeared into the hotel, and the crowd released a collective breath. People began talking all at once, excitement and relief mixing into a chaotic celebration. But Caleb felt no urge to celebrate. He'd seen the look in Vane's eyes, recognized the dangerous calculation of a man who'd been cornered and was now considering his options. "He's not giving up," Elena said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "No. He's regrouping, planning his next move. We've blocked his legal path, so now he'll try something else." "What else is there?" "Violence," Rourke said, joining their conversation. "I've seen operations like this before. When legal methods fail, the people behind them often resort to intimidation, property destruction, even murder if they're desperate enough. And make no mistake, Vane is desperate now. We've exposed his scheme, humiliated him publicly, cost him whatever profit he expected to make. Men like that don't just accept defeat and walk away." "Then we need to be ready," Bill said, having overheard. "Postguards on the ranches most at risk. Make sure nobody's vulnerable or isolated. Safety in numbers." Mallory cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "I meant what I said about riding to Helena. But I'm leaving Deputy Carson here, and I'm officially deputizing anyone who volunteers to help maintain order while I'm gone. That gives you legal authority to defend property and people if Vane tries anything." Hands shot up across the crowd. Within minutes, Mallory had sworn in 15 temporary deputies, including Caleb, Elena, Bill, and Tom. It wasn't an army, but it was something, official sanction to stand against whatever came next. As the crowd began to disperse, organizing themselves into watch groups and defensive positions, Caleb found himself standing with Elena and Rourke, watching the Grand Hotel with wary attention. "How long before Mallory gets back from Helena?" Elena asked. 12 hours there, minimum. However long it takes to convince a federal prosecutor to act, then 12 hours back. 2 days if we're lucky, 3 or 4 if the bureaucracy moves at its usual pace. Caleb felt the weight of that timeline. Lot can happen in 2 days. Then we make sure nothing does, Rourke said. "I'm going to prepare formal documentation for the prosecutor, every piece of evidence clearly organized, every finding properly notated. If Mallory shows up with an airtight case, it'll be harder for anyone to dismiss or delay." "What about Vane's backers?" Elena asked. "The people funding this operation, providing the forgers and corrupt judges. When they realize their scheme is failing, they might cut Vane loose, but they might also double down to protect their investment." "One fight at a time," Caleb said, though he knew she was right to worry. Somewhere behind Vane stood people with real power and resources, people who wouldn't appreciate having their criminal enterprise exposed. But that was a problem for after they survived the immediate threat. The day passed in tense preparation. Ranchers fortified their properties, gathering livestock closer to buildings, preparing to defend what was theirs. The temporary deputies organized patrol routes that would keep eyes on the most vulnerable ranches while maintaining a presence in town. Through it all, the Grand Hotel remained quiet, Vane and his men staying inside, their absence somehow more threatening than their presence would have been. As evening approached, Caleb stood on his own porch, looking out across land that suddenly seemed more precious than ever. Elena emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, handing him one as she leaned against the railing beside him. "Been a hell of a week," she said. "Week ago I was still living like a ghost, barely going through the motions." Caleb took a sip of the coffee, grateful for the warmth. "Funny how fast things can change." "You regret any of it? The fight, the risk, the disruption to your carefully maintained isolation?" He considered the question seriously. A week ago, his life had been predictable, safe in its numbness, protected from further pain by the simple expedient of caring about nothing. Now everything was chaos and danger and uncertainty, but also purpose and connection and the fierce satisfaction of fighting for something that mattered. "No," he said finally, "no regrets. Even if we lose, even if Vane somehow wins in the end, at least I'll have tried. That's more than I've been able to say for 3 years. We're not going to lose. Elena's voice carried absolute conviction. Vane's scheme is exposed, the evidence is documented, and we have an entire community standing together. He can threaten and bluster all he wants, but the truth is stronger than his lies. Hope you're right. I'm always right. You just haven't known me long enough to realize it yet. Despite everything, Caleb smiled. That confidence based on evidence or just general stubbornness? Little of both. She turned to face him directly, her expression softening. Caleb, I want you to know, whatever happens in the next few days, I'm glad I broke into your house and scared the hell out of you. This fight, this community, you, it's given me something I thought I'd lost when my father's ranch was stolen. Hope, I guess. The belief that good people can still win sometimes. Before Caleb could respond, a shout came from the direction of town, urgent and alarmed. They both turned to see a rider approaching fast, and as he drew closer, Caleb recognized Jacob Barnes, the general store owner, his face flushed with exertion and fear. Fire! Jacob shouted as he reined in his horse. The courthouse is burning, and the Grand Hotel is empty. Vane and his men are gone. Caleb and Elena were already moving, calling for their horses, grabbing weapons and supplies. Within minutes, they were galloping toward town, joined by other riders who'd heard the alarm. As they crested the rise that overlooked Dry Creek, Caleb saw the orange glow against the darkening sky, flames reaching up from the courthouse like accusatory fingers. The courthouse wasn't much, a 2-story wooden building that served as the administrative center for the entire region, but it held something critically important: land records, deeds, surveys, historical documentation of who owned what, going back decades. If those records were destroyed, proving ownership became exponentially harder, especially for ranchers whose families had held their land for generations, but whose paperwork might not be perfect. By the time they reached the burning building, it was clearly beyond saving. Flames had engulfed the upper floor where the records were kept, and even the bucket brigade that had formed was focusing on stopping the spread to adjacent buildings rather than saving the courthouse itself. Caleb joined the effort automatically, passing buckets in a chain that stretched from the town well to the fire line, the heat intense enough to sear exposed skin even from yards away. It took hours to contain the blaze, and when it was finally reduced to smoldering ruins, the exhausted townspeople stood staring at the destruction with a mixture of anger and despair. The courthouse had been the solid center of their legal world, and now it was ashes. This was deliberate, Deputy Carson said, examining the perimeter of the building with the aid of a lantern. I can see where it started, multiple points of ignition, all carefully placed to ensure maximum damage to the record storage area. Vane! Elena spat the name like a curse. He realized we had him trapped legally, so he destroyed the legal framework itself. No land records means no way to prove who owns what, which means chaos, Caleb finished. Exactly what he needs to continue operating. Without clear title records, he can claim anything, and we'll have a hell of a time proving him wrong. Not everything was in there, Jacob said, coughing from smoke inhalation. Most folks have their own copies of deeds and titles, and the county keeps duplicates of newer records in Helena. But the historical stuff, the old surveys and transfer documents, that's gone. Just gone. This is exactly what Vane wanted, Rourke said, emerging from the shadows where he'd been examining the ruins. Destroy the documentary evidence, create enough confusion that his forgeries become harder to challenge. Classic tactic in land fraud cases. Where's Vane now? Caleb asked Deputy Carson. Don't know. Like Jacob said, he and his men cleared out of the hotel before the fire started. Could be anywhere, camped outside town, already heading for the next territory, or preparing to come back and capitalize on the chaos. Or preparing something worse, Elena said grimly. As if to confirm her words, another rider appeared, this one from the direction of the Whitmore Ranch. Even in the darkness, Caleb could see the man's agitation as he approached. Tom sent me, the rider gasped, barely pausing to dismount. There's armed men surrounding his ranch. Showed up about an hour ago, claimed they were federal marshals executing a seizure order, but Tom doesn't believe them, says they're not acting like real law enforcement. He's barricaded inside with his family, but he's outnumbered and asking for help. Caleb felt ice settling in his stomach. How many men? Tom counted at least 8, maybe more, all armed, all professional looking. They gave him until midnight to surrender the property peacefully, or they'd take it by force. Deputy Carson checked his pocket watch. That gives us less than 2 hours. It's a setup, Elena said immediately. Vane's forcing a confrontation, betting that we'll either back down or respond with violence that he can use to discredit us. Either way, he thinks he wins. Then we don't give him what he expects, Caleb said. We respond, but we do it smart. Overwhelming numbers, but no aggression. Show these fake marshals that they're outgunned and outwitted. Give them a chance to back down without bloodshed. And if they don't back down, Bill asked, having joined the gathering crowd, then we defend Tom and his family, and we deal with the consequences. Caleb raised his voice to address the assembled townspeople. Everyone who's willing and able, get your horses and weapons. We ride to the Whitmore Ranch now. But understand this. We're going there to prevent violence, not to start it. No one fires unless fired upon. No one escalates unless forced to. We're better than Vane and his thugs, and we're going to prove it tonight. Within 30 minutes, nearly 40 riders were assembled, every temporary deputy and twice as many volunteers. It was the largest group of armed citizens Dry Creek had seen since the range wars of the previous generation, and Caleb felt the weight of responsibility for keeping them focused and disciplined. They rode through the darkness in tight formation, the sound of hoofbeats like thunder across the valley floor. As they approached the Whitmore Ranch, Caleb could see exactly what Tom's messenger had described. Armed men positioned around the property, a perimeter that looked professional and military rather than legal or civilian. The riders spread out as they approached, forming their own perimeter that outnumbered and surrounded Vane's forces. It was a statement of strength without aggression, a show of force meant to deter rather than provoke. A man emerged from Vane's group, and even in the moonlight, Caleb recognized him, the security operative who'd been with Vane since the beginning. Up close, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who'd been in combat, who knew how to assess threats and calculate odds. "You folks need to disperse," the man said, his voice carrying authority that sounded almost legitimate. "This is a federal operation executing lawful orders. Interfering makes you all accomplices to obstruction." "Funny," Caleb said, riding forward slightly, "because the sheriff of this county informed Marcus Vane this morning that all seizure orders were suspended pending federal investigation of fraud. So either you're operating without current authorization or you're not federal marshals at all." "Show us your credentials," Deputy Carson demanded. "Real federal marshals carry documentation. Let's see it." The man's hand moved toward his coat, but instead of pulling out identification, he gestured sharply to his men. Caleb heard the distinctive sound of rifles being cocked, saw weapons being raised around the perimeter of Vane's forces. "Last chance," the security man said. "Ride away now, or this situation gets complicated for everyone." "You're outnumbered 3-1, Elena called out. "And unlike you, we actually have legal authority. Deputy Carson is acting sheriff while Mallory's in Helena, and half the people here are sworn deputies. You want complicated? Try explaining to a real federal judge why you were threatening citizens at gunpoint while impersonating law enforcement." For a long moment, the two groups faced each other in the darkness, and Caleb could feel the situation balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one nervous trigger finger, and this could become a massacre that would haunt the valley for generations. Then the ranch house door opened, and Tom Whitmore emerged, standing on his porch in full view of everyone. He was unarmed, hands visible and empty, his wife and son behind him in the doorway. "I'm not leaving my home," Tom said, his voice steady despite the clear fear on his face. "This land is mine, paid for with my family's blood and sweat across 3 generations. You want it? You're going to have to drag me off it in front of all these witnesses. And then you're going to have to explain to the real federal authorities why you committed assault against a citizen defending legitimate property rights." The security man's jaw tightened, and Caleb saw him doing the calculations. Whatever Vane had paid him, it probably wasn't enough to justify this level of exposure and risk. The man made a sharp gesture, and his forces began to lower their weapons, backing toward their horses. "This isn't over," he said, mounting up. "Vane's got resources you can't imagine, connections in places you'll never reach. You think you've won something tonight, but all you've done is delay the inevitable." "Then we'll delay it again tomorrow," Caleb said, "and the next day, and the day after that for as long as it takes. Because we're not going anywhere, and neither is Tom Whitmore or anyone else in this valley. Vane's forces withdrew into the darkness, their retreat watched by dozens of eyes until the last hoofbeat faded into silence. Only then did the tension break, the assembled ranchers allowing themselves to breathe again, to realize they'd just faced down armed mercenaries without firing a shot. Tom came down from his porch, his legs visibly shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "I don't know what to say. If you hadn't come, we did come," Bill said firmly. "That's what community means. Nobody stands alone. Nobody faces this kind of threat without backup." As the crowd began to disperse, organizing themselves into guard rotations to make sure Vane's men didn't return, Caleb found himself standing with Elena and Rourke, looking out across the darkened valley. "Vane's running out of options," Rourke observed. "He's tried legal fraud, intimidation, arson, impersonating federal officers. Each failure makes him more desperate and more dangerous." "Which means the next attempt will be worse," Elena said. "He's not the type to just accept defeat and leave. Men like that, they'd rather burn everything to the ground than admit they lost." "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance." Caleb felt the exhaustion of the long day and the longer week catching up with him, but underneath it was something stronger, determination forged in crisis and tested by fire. Mallory should be back from Helena tomorrow or the next day with federal authority to shut this down permanently. We just need to hold out until then. "Just," Elena repeated with dark humor. As if that's something simple. Nothing about this has been simple. But we're still standing, still fighting, and Vane keeps losing. That has to count for something. They returned to town as the night deepened toward morning, leaving guard rotations at the vulnerable ranches and a general sense that they'd crossed some crucial threshold. The fight wasn't over. Might not be over for days or weeks yet, but momentum had shifted decisively. Vane had tried everything in his arsenal and failed to break the community's resistance. Now the question was what he'd try next, and whether they'd be ready when he did. Caleb lay down in his bed that night, too exhausted to even remove his boots, and found himself thinking about Sarah, not with the crushing grief that had defined the last 3 years, but with a different kind of awareness. She would have been proud of this fight, he thought, proud that he'd found something worth defending, worth risking everything for, proud that the ranch she'd loved was still standing, still worth fighting for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new crises, probably new attacks from Vane and his backers. But tonight, they'd held the line. Tonight, the good guys had won. And sometimes, Caleb thought as sleep finally claimed him, that was enough to keep going. Dawn broke cold and clear over Dry Creek, the kind of morning that promised either new beginnings or final reckonings. Caleb woke to the sound of horses in his yard and emerged onto the porch to find Deputy Carson dismounting, his face etched with exhaustion, but carrying news that seemed to light him from within. "Sheriff's back," Carson said without preamble. "Rode all night to get here. He's got federal marshals with him, real ones this time, and papers that'll make Vane wish he'd never heard of Montana." Caleb felt something release in his chest, tension he'd been carrying for days finally beginning to ease. "Where is he now?" "Town Square. He's calling everyone together for 9 o'clock. Said to make sure you and Elena are there, and Rourke too. This ends today, Caleb. One way or another, it ends today." By the time Caleb and Elena rode into town an hour later, it seemed like the entire valley had converged on Dry Creek. The square was packed with ranchers and their families, townspeople, anyone who had a stake in what had become the defining crisis of their generation. Caleb saw faces he recognized and others he didn't, people who'd traveled from distant spreads just to witness whatever was about to unfold. Sheriff Mallory stood on the church steps, flanked by 3 men in the unmistakable uniforms of federal marshals, their presence carrying an authority that transcended local politics and corruption. Beside them stood a 4th man, older, distinguished, wearing the kind of suit that came from Helena or even farther east. When Mallory spotted Caleb and Elena, he gestured them forward urgently. "Caleb Turner, Elena Cross, this is Federal Prosecutor James Hartwell," Mallory said, his voice carrying relief and vindication in equal measure. "Mr. Hartwell, these are 2 of the people who uncovered Vane's operation and fought to protect this community." Hartwell extended his hand, his grip firm and assessing. "Sheriff Mallory briefed me on your investigation. quite impressive work, especially the forensic analysis Mr. Rourke provided. Is he here? Right here. Rourke emerged from the crowd, his satchel still clutched protectively. I have additional documentation if you need it, including photographic evidence of the forged seals and comparative analysis of— I've seen your initial report, Hartwell interrupted, but not unkindly. It's exactly the kind of evidence we needed. Clear, methodical, absolutely damning. Based on what you've provided and what Sheriff Mallory testified to, I was able to secure emergency federal orders that supersede all local court actions. He pulled documents from his own case, holding them up for the crowd to see. First, an immediate injunction halting all property seizures related to Marcus Vane's claims. Second, arrest warrants for Vane and his known associates on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, impersonating federal officers, and a half-dozen other felonies. Third, an order for Judge Morrison to appear before a federal grand jury to explain his role in this scheme. A cheer went up from the crowd, but Hartwell raised his hand for silence. There's more. We've been investigating similar patterns of land fraud across 3 territories. Vane's operation isn't isolated. It's part of a larger criminal enterprise that's been stealing property from honest citizens for years. But this valley, this community, is the first place where people fought back hard enough and smart enough to expose the whole operation. He turned to face the assembled ranchers directly. What you've done here matters beyond your own properties. The evidence you've gathered, the testimony you can provide, it's going to help us dismantle this entire network. You've quite literally saved hundreds of families from the same fate. Caleb felt Elena's hand find his, squeezing tight. He looked at her and saw tears tracking down her face, not of sadness, but of overwhelming relief and vindication. What happens now? Bill called out from the crowd. Vane's still out there somewhere. His men tried to take Tom's ranch last night. Are we safe? The marshals will be conducting searches throughout the region, Hartwell said. We have descriptions of Vane and his associates, and every law enforcement office in Montana has been notified. He can run, but he won't get far. His expression hardened. And when we catch him, I promise you he'll face justice for everything he's done. There's still the matter of the courthouse, Jacob pointed out. The land records that were destroyed in the fire. How do we prove ownership without those documents? The fire was arson, we're certain of that, Mallory said. But most of the critical records have duplicates either in Helena or in private hands. It'll take time to reconstruct everything, but the federal government is committing resources to help. Nobody's going to lose their land because Vane burned down a building. As the crowd began to disperse, energized by hope instead of driven by fear for the first time in weeks, one of the federal marshals approached Caleb directly. The man was young, but carried himself with competent authority, his eyes constantly scanning the environment with professional wariness. Mr. Turner, I'm Marshal Davis. We have reason to believe Vane may attempt one final action before fleeing the territory. Men like him, when their operations collapse, they often become unpredictable, vengeful. Is there anywhere you think he might target? Anyone he might go after? Caleb considered the question, thinking through everything that had happened, every confrontation, every moment when Vane's mask had slipped to reveal the calculating predator beneath. He blamed me personally, Caleb said slowly. At the hotel, after we exposed him. He said I'd made a powerful enemy. If he's going to strike out at anyone, it'll probably be me. Then we need to make sure you're protected. I'd like to station men at your ranch, keep you under observation until Vane is apprehended. No. Caleb's response was immediate and firm. You station armed guards at my place. Vane will know it's a trap and stay away. Better to make it look like business as usual. Let him think I'm vulnerable if he wants to try something. That's using yourself as bait, Elena said sharply. That's exactly the kind of stupid, noble gesture that gets people killed. It's also the fastest way to end this. Vane's dangerous as long as he's free. We draw him out, we end the threat permanently. Caleb looked at Marshal Davis. You can have men hidden nearby, ready to move in at first sign of trouble, but the ranch itself needs to look unguarded. Davis exchanged glances with his fellow marshals, clearly uncomfortable with the plan, but also recognizing its logic. We'd need you to wear a signal device, something you could trigger if you needed immediate assistance. Whatever it takes, but we do this today, before Vane gets spooked and disappears for good. The plan came together with the speed of desperate necessity. Caleb would return to his ranch and maintain normal routines while federal marshals positioned themselves in concealed locations around the property. Elena insisted on being there as well, refusing to be relegated to town while Caleb put himself at risk. Rourke volunteered to stay visible in Dry Creek, both as a potential secondary target and as a coordinator for the marshals. By noon, everything was in place. Caleb worked in his yard, repairing the fence section that still needed attention, while Elena moved between the house and barn with deliberate casualness. To anyone watching, it would look like an ordinary day on a working ranch. No guards, no unusual activity, just two people going about their business. The marshals were hidden in the tree line to the north, in the old line shack to the east, behind the ridge to the south. Davis himself was in the barn loft, positioned where he could see the entire approach to the house. The signal device they'd given Caleb was a small metal whistle, its sound distinctive enough to carry across distance, but ordinary enough not to seem suspicious. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The afternoon sun tracked across the sky, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber as evening approached. Caleb found himself glancing toward the horizon repeatedly, searching for riders who never appeared. Maybe they'd been wrong. Maybe Vane had already fled, was already miles away, putting as much distance as possible between himself and the collapsing ruins of his scheme. Then, as the sun touched the western hills, Elena called out from the house, "Caleb! Riders coming from the east!" He straightened, shading his eyes against the slanting light. 3 men on horseback, moving at a steady pace that suggested purpose rather than flight. As they drew closer, Caleb recognized Vane in the lead, flanked by his lawyer and the security operative who'd led last night's failed assault on the Whitmore ranch. Caleb's hand moved to his pocket, fingers closing around the signal whistle, but he didn't blow it yet. Let them come closer. Let them commit to whatever action they'd planned. The marshals would need clear evidence of criminal intent to make arrests that would stick. Vane reined in his horse 20 yards from the porch, and even from that distance, Caleb could see the change in him. The smooth facade was gone completely, replaced by barely controlled fury and something more dangerous, the desperate calculation of a man with nothing left to lose. "Turner," Vane said, his voice tight, "thought I'd find you here, playing farmer while your friends in town celebrate their little victory." "It's not little, and it's not mine," Caleb replied, keeping his own voice level. "It's the community's victory, justice's victory. You lost, Vane. Accept it and move on." "Move on?" Vane laughed, the sound ugly and brittle. "Move on to what? Prison? Ruin? Having my name dragged through courts while sanctimonious prosecutors make their careers on my downfall?" He dismounted slowly, his associates doing the same. "No, I don't think I'll just accept that. I think I'll take something with me. Something to make this whole disaster feel less like total defeat." Elena emerged from the house, her hand resting on the rifle she carried openly. "You're outnumbered and out of options, Vane. Federal marshals have warrants for your arrest. You try anything here, you'll just add more charges to an already long list." "Federal marshals," Vane repeated mockingly. "I don't see any marshals. I see 2 ranchers on an isolated property, no witnesses, no help coming. I see an opportunity to deliver a message about the cost of interfering with people far more powerful than you can imagine." His security man's hand moved to his gun, not drawing yet but making his intentions clear. The lawyer stayed mounted, clearly uncomfortable with whatever Vane was planning, but too complicit to object. "Last chance," Caleb said quietly. "Right away now. Take whatever head start you can get and disappear. Nobody needs to die today." "You're right about that," Vane agreed. "Nobody needs to die. But somebody will anyway, because I've spent 6 months building this operation, invested everything I have into making it work, and I'll be damned if I let some grief-addled rancher and a vengeful daughter destroy it without consequences." The security man's hand closed on his weapon, beginning to draw, and Caleb's fingers found the whistle in his pocket. But before he could blow it, before the situation could explode into violence, a voice called out from the direction of the barn. "Federal marshals, drop your weapons and raise your hands. You're surrounded." Marshal Davis emerged from the barn, rifle trained on Vane's group, while simultaneously marshals appeared from the tree line, the line shack, the ridge, surrounding Vane's party from every direction. It was a perfectly executed convergence, giving Vane and his men no avenue of escape, No option but surrender. For a heartbeat, Caleb thought Vane's security man might try something anyway, might decide death in a shootout was preferable to prison. But Davis's voice cut through the tension with absolute authority. Don't. You draw that weapon and you're dead before it clears leather. Put it down slowly and step away from the horse. The security man's jaw clenched, but survival instinct won over loyalty or pride. He carefully removed his gun and placed it on the ground, raising his hands. The lawyer was already dismounting, hands high, babbling about cooperation and making deals. Vane himself remained motionless, staring at Caleb with pure hatred. You think this ends anything? The people I work for, the network behind this operation, you've barely scratched the surface. They'll find other veins, other schemes, other valleys to plunder. This doesn't end. Maybe not forever, Caleb agreed, but it ends here. It ends today. And every person you didn't steal from, every family that keeps their home because we stood up to you, that's a victory that matters, whether you understand it or not. The marshals moved in efficiently, securing Vane and his associates with practiced precision. As they led the prisoners toward horses for the ride to jail, Prosecutor Hartwell emerged from where he'd been observing the entire confrontation. Threatening federal witnesses, conspiracy to commit violence, attempted intimidation. I count at least 3 more charges we can add to the existing list, Hartwell said with grim satisfaction. Mr. Vane, you've just ensured that when you do eventually see the inside of a courtroom, you'll be old and gray before you see freedom again. Vane didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge Hartwell's presence. He simply stared at Caleb as the marshals led him away. And Caleb met that stare without flinching, without satisfaction or triumph, just quiet certainty that this particular fight was finally over. As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, the marshals dispersing to transport prisoners and file reports, Caleb and Elena stood in the yard watching the sun complete its descent toward the horizon. The valley spread before them in evening light, the same land Caleb had looked at countless times over the years. But somehow, it appeared different now. Not diminished by grief or threatened by corruption, but solid and enduring and worth every fight they'd waged to protect it. It's really over, Elena said, her voice carrying wonder and residual disbelief. We actually won. We won, Caleb confirmed. The community won. Truth won. What happens now? To Vane? To the others? To all of this? Trials, eventually. Vane and his associates will face justice. Morrison will have to answer for his role, and the network Hartwell mentioned. They'll be exposed and prosecuted across multiple territories. Caleb turned to look at her directly. But that's somebody else's fight now. Ours is finished. The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications neither was quite ready to address directly. The crisis that had thrown them together was resolved. Elena had avenged her father, had seen the man who destroyed her family brought to justice. Caleb had saved his ranch, had honored Sarah's memory by defending what they'd built together. The obligations that had bonded them in shared purpose were fulfilled. So what are you going to do? Caleb asked quietly. Now that it's over? Elena was silent for a long moment, looking out across the valley as darkness gathered in the low places and the first stars began to appear. I should go back to my father, she said finally. Check on him. Help him understand that we got justice, even if it doesn't give him back what he lost. He deserves to know that Vane will pay for what he did. You should, Caleb agreed, and meant it, even as something in his chest tightened at the thought of her leaving. But then I'll come back, Elena continued, turning to face him. If that's something you'd want. If there's room here for someone who's stubborn and opinionated and terrible at asking permission before breaking into houses. Caleb felt a smile tugging at his lips despite the weight of the moment. Might be room. Ranch needs a lot of work. Could use someone with actual ranching skills instead of just someone going through the motions. Just the ranch that needs work? Elena asked, her eyes searching his face. No, Caleb admitted. Not just the ranch. But it's a start. And maybe starts are enough for now. Enough for now, Elena agreed. But Caleb, I need you to understand what you'd be getting. I'm not Sarah. I can't be her. Won't try to be her. If I come back, if we do this, it has to be something new. Not replacing what you lost, but building something different. I know. And he did know, had known since that first morning when he'd found her in his kitchen, calmly cooking in a house that had been a tomb. Sarah was Sarah, and she's gone. But maybe it's time to stop living in a grave and start living in a house again. Maybe it's time to let this place be more than just a monument to the past. They stood together as full darkness claimed the valley, and for the first time in 3 years, Caleb felt the future opening before him as something other than an empty extension of grief. There would be work to do, repairing the ranch, helping the community rebuild, possibly testifying at trials. There would be difficult days, memories that still hurt, moments when the weight of loss would return. But there would also be this: Elena's presence, the possibility of partnership, the chance to discover whether two people forged together in crisis could build something lasting in peace. The week that followed brought a strange mixture of celebration and bureaucracy. Federal investigators descended on Dry Creek, documenting evidence, taking statements, building the case against Vane and the larger network he'd been part of. Prosecutor Hartwell proved true to his word, working tirelessly to ensure that every victim of the fraud would have their property rights restored and documented. The courthouse records, while destroyed in the fire, were gradually reconstructed through a combination of duplicate documents from Helena, private deed collections, and testimony from longtime residents who remembered the history of land transfers. It was painstaking work, but the federal government's commitment of resources meant it progressed faster than anyone had dared hope. Judge Morrison was quietly removed from his position pending investigation, though whether he would ultimately face criminal charges remained unclear. The prevailing theory was that he'd been incompetent rather than corrupt, too willing to accept official-looking documents without proper scrutiny. It didn't excuse his role in enabling Vane's scheme, but it suggested his involvement had been passive rather than active. Tom Whitmore's ranch was restored to his full legal possession, the seizure order invalidated along with all of Vane's other claims. The Albertson brothers, who'd sold their property in panic, were given the option to repurchase it at the price they'd received, plus damages. Similar restorations occurred across the valley as the full scope of Vane's fraud was unwound. Through it all, the community maintained the solidarity they'd forged in crisis. The temporary deputies continued their patrols even after the immediate threat had passed, partly from vigilance and partly from the simple pleasure of purposeful cooperation. Jacob's General Store became an informal gathering place where people traded stories and speculations about the ongoing investigation. Elena left after 5 days, riding south to check on her father and begin the legal process of reclaiming their stolen ranch. Before she went, she and Caleb stood in the same spot where they'd watched Vane being arrested, the place that was already becoming in Caleb's mind the marker between his old life and whatever came next. "I'll be back in 6 weeks," she said, and it was a promise, not a question. "My father's case is being handled by the same federal prosecutors, and Hartwell says the evidence is strong enough that restoration should be straightforward. Once that's settled, once he's stable and has support, you'll come back," Caleb finished. "I know. I'll be here. You better be. I've gotten used to having coffee waiting for me in the mornings and an actual conversation partner who doesn't think stubbornness is a personality flaw. It's not a flaw when it's directed at the right targets." Elena smiled, reaching up to touch his face with a gentleness that contrasted with her usual directness. "Take care of yourself, Caleb Turner. Fix that back window latch. Maybe plant something in that garden plot by the creek. Let yourself imagine a future worth living in." "I'll work on it," he promised. He watched her ride away into the morning light, and this time the watching didn't feel like loss. It felt like pause, like the space between one chapter ending and another beginning. He had work to do, both practical and emotional, and 6 weeks seemed like exactly the right amount of time to do it. The ranch itself seemed to sense the change. Caleb attacked long-deferred repairs with new energy, fixing not just what was broken, but improving what still worked. He cleared the garden plot Elena had mentioned, turning soil that hadn't been touched since Sarah's last planting. He fixed the back window latch, and in doing so found himself fixing a dozen other small things he'd been ignoring for years. Bill Hendricks stopped by one afternoon to help install new fence posts, and they worked side by side in companionable silence until Bill finally spoke what had been on his mind. "You seem different, Caleb, more like your old self before Sarah passed. Good to see." "Feel different," Caleb admitted. "Like I've been asleep for 3 years and finally woke up. Not all the way, not completely, but enough." Elena coming back? She said she would. Bill nodded, pounding a post into place with steady strikes. She's good for you, good for the ranch. Hell, she's good for the whole valley. Woman's got the kind of spine most men wish they had. That she does. You scared? About starting something new? Building something different than what you had with Sarah? Caleb considered the question honestly. Terrified, he admitted, but I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life alone in that house, just waiting to die. At least this way, being scared means I'm actually living again. 6 weeks passed faster than Caleb expected, filled with work and gradual healing and the slow reconstruction of hope. The valley settled into a new normal, one where people knew they could defend themselves when threatened, where community meant more than just proximity, where standing together had proven more powerful than legal manipulation or intimidation. Prosecutor Hartwell sent regular updates on the investigation. Vane was in federal custody, his bail denied after prosecutors demonstrated flight risk. His lawyer had turned state's witness, providing detailed testimony about the forgery operation in exchange for reduced charges. The security operative was cooperating as well, naming names and describing the network of corrupt officials and criminal operators that had enabled schemes like Vane's across multiple territories. Most importantly for Elena, her father's ranch was officially restored to him, the forged documents invalidated and proper title reestablished. Daniel Cross remained diminished by his stroke, but Elena wrote that he'd smiled when she told him they'd won, had squeezed her hand with something like his old strength. It wasn't everything they'd lost, but it was something worth having. When Elena finally rode back into Caleb's yard on a bright October morning, the valley had transformed into autumn glory, aspens turning gold on the hillsides, the air carrying the crisp promise of coming winter. Caleb was working on the garden plot, planting spring bulbs that wouldn't bloom until he and Elena had weathered a winter together, making a declaration of faith in futures and seasons yet to come. He stood as she dismounted, and they faced each other across 10 feet of distance that felt simultaneously vast and negligible. You planted the garden, Elena observed. Seemed like the right time. Thought maybe come spring, we could expand it, put in vegetables, maybe some herbs, make it a working garden instead of just decorative. We, Elena repeated, testing the word. That's a presumption, Mr. Turner. Is it wrong? No. She closed the distance between them, and Caleb could see in her eyes everything she'd been through in the past 6 weeks, the bureaucratic frustrations, the emotional weight of settling her father's affairs, the determination that had carried her through it all and brought her back here. No, it's exactly right. They didn't kiss, didn't embrace, not yet. Instead, they stood together looking at the garden plot and the house beyond it, at the valley spreading out in autumn splendor, at the future they were beginning to build through small acts of cultivation and repair. I talked to my father before I left, Elena said quietly. Told him I was coming back here, starting over with someone who understood loss and survival. You know what he said? What? He said Sarah would be glad, that she'd want you to be happy, to keep living, to let the land live again, instead of letting it become a memorial. Elena paused. I think he's right. I think wherever she is, whatever you believe about what comes after, she's glad you're choosing this instead of choosing slow death. Caleb felt tears burning behind his eyes, but didn't fight them. I think so too. I hope so. So what now? Where do we start? Here, Caleb said simply. We start with this garden, with fixing this ranch, with getting through winter together. We start small and build from there, same way people have always built lives worth living. That's not very romantic, Elena observed. No, but it's honest. And honest is what we both need right now. Honest, Elena agreed. I can work with honest. They turned toward the house together, and as they walked, Caleb saw what he'd been too grief-blind to see for 3 years. The beauty of this place, the potential still locked in every acre, the possibility that life could continue and grow and surprise him with joy even after the worst losses. The ranch that had been his tomb was becoming his home again. Not the same home it had been with Sarah, but something new and equally precious. That evening, they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the valley, and Caleb told Elena stories about Sarah, not the painful stories of her death, but the good memories of their life together, the dreams they'd shared, the love that had built this place. And Elena listened without jealousy or discomfort, understanding that honoring the past didn't diminish the future. "She would have liked you," Caleb said as the stars began to emerge. "You're different in 100 ways, but the core strength, the absolute refusal to quit, she had that too. You would have been friends, I think." "I hope so. I'd like to think I'm living up to what she started here." "You are. We are." Caleb took her hand, feeling the calluses that matched his own, the physical evidence of lives spent in honest labor. "Together." The word hung in the air between them, a promise and a plan. And as the night settled over the valley, Caleb Turner allowed himself something he hadn't permitted in 3 years. He allowed himself to believe that tomorrow would be better than today, that next month would be better than this one, that the future held possibilities beyond mere survival. The ranch lights burned warm against the darkness, not in defiance, but in welcome. The land that had been Sarah's legacy was becoming Elena's home. And Caleb, who'd been barely alive for so long, was finally, tentatively, beginning to live again. Somewhere in the night, coyotes called to each other across the valley. Cattle lowed in distant pastures. The wind whispered through grass that had witnessed generations of human struggle and triumph. And on a porch that had seen both joy and grief, 2 people sat together in comfortable silence, building the foundation of whatever would come next. It wasn't the ending Caleb had imagined when this all started. It was better, messier and more uncertain, but charged with genuine hope instead of desperate fantasy. They'd fought for their land and won. They'd stood against corruption and prevailed. They'd found each other in crisis and chosen to see what they could build in peace. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. As the night deepened and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, Caleb Turner closed his eyes and felt something he'd thought lost forever: contentment. Not the naive happiness of someone who'd never suffered, but the hard-won peace of someone who'd walked through darkness and found their way back to light. The reckoning at Dry Creek was over. The future was just beginning. And for the first time in 3 years, Caleb was ready to meet it.